You're not a sniper, Donovan. You're a babysitter with a rifle. Chief Barrett ripped the weapon from her hands in front of the entire unit, laughed in her face, turned to the room, and made sure every man heard it. The laughter hit like a wave. Nobody stopped it, not even the commander. Claire Donovan didn't flinch, didn't blink. She looked Barrett dead in the eye and said 7 words so quietly the room went completely silent. And Commander Grant Mercer felt his blood run cold. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe and stay until the end. You will not regret it. The rifle case Claire Donovan carried onto the mountain that morning was old. Not beat up old. Not neglected old, but the kind of old that comes from years of being handled carefully, packed precisely, and never once left behind. The latches were worn smooth. The corners of the case had been reinforced with tape that had been replaced so many times the layers had fused together into something almost permanent. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you might assume she'd borrowed it from a storage room. If you did know what you were looking at, you might start asking questions you weren't sure you wanted answered. Claire didn't invite either reaction. She walked through the main doors of the Joint Training Facility at Fort Elkhorn, a remote complex buried so deep in the Montana mountains that the nearest town was 40 minutes of gravel road in good weather, and she moved the way people move. When they've learned that calling attention to yourself is a luxury you can rarely afford. Head level, pace steady, eyes already scanning the room before her boots cleared the threshold. The facility smelled like every military building she'd ever been in. Burnt coffee, industrial cleaning solution, the particular staleness of recycled mountain air pushed through government-issue ventilation. A row of lockers lined the left wall. A scheduling board covered the right. At the far end, a briefing table that could seat 20 held 6 men who stopped talking the moment she walked in. She recognized the type immediately. Not individually, she'd never met any of them. But she recognized the posture, the particular way elite operators occupy space. Like they've never once had to justify their presence anywhere and couldn't imagine a world where they would. These were Commander Grant Mercer's men, Tier 1 SEALs, veterans of places that didn't appear on official maps. Men who had walked into situations that most trained professionals would call unsurvivable and had walked back out again. Claire set her case down next to the wall, unfolded her assignment orders, and placed them on the corner of the briefing table. Nobody moved to look at them. A broad-shouldered man at the center of the table leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. His name tape read Barrett. Chief Owen Barrett. She'd read the personnel files during her drive up. 12 years in, 4 combat deployments, the kind of record that got pinned to recruiting posters. He had the eyes of someone who had decided the outcome of this situation before she'd ever opened the door. Instructor Donovan, he said. Not a greeting, a categorization. Staff Sergeant, she said, equally flat. Barrett looked at the man on his left. Something passed between them, not words, not even a real expression. Just the shared understanding of 2 people who had already agreed on something. Headquarters sent you to observe the Overwatch evaluation, Barrett said. I read the orders. That's the word they used. That's one of the words they used, Claire replied. The door behind her opened and Commander Grant Mercer stepped into the room. Grant Mercer was not what the file photo suggested. In photographs, he looked like what the military produced when it ran its best machinery, at full capacity for long enough squared shoulders, hard jaw, the particular composure that comes from never having shown fear in front of someone who was watching. In person, he was all of that, but there was something underneath it that the photographs hadn't captured. A weight. The kind that settles into a person slowly, year by year, mission by mission, until it becomes indistinguishable from who they are. He looked at Claire, then at the orders on the table, then at Claire again. Staff Sergeant Donovan, he said. You've been assigned as a training observer and assistant range evaluator for the duration of Exercise Ridgeback. Yes, sir. Your service record includes Marine Scout Sniper qualification, 2 overseas deployments, and 3 years instructing at Quantico. Yes, sir. Mercer picked up the orders. He read them the way a man reads something he already understands, but is looking for a specific line he might have missed the first time. When he set them back down, his expression hadn't changed. You'll have observer status during tomorrow's live fire evaluation. Any questions? 1, Claire said. The Overwatch position marked on the operational plan, the ridge above the eastern face of the mine complex. What time is the evaluation scheduled to begin? Mercer glanced at Barrett. 0700, Barrett said, and something in his tone made it clear. He expected a follow-up he was prepared to shut down. valley below that ridge runs east to west, Claire said. Sunrise hits the face at approximately 07:15 this time of year. Within 20 minutes of the light shifting, thermal currents from the valley floor will begin rising along the eastern wall. By 07:40, you'll have visible distortion at ranges beyond 600 yards. The overwatch position will be functionally compromised before your first shooter completes a full string of fire. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Barrett laughed. It wasn't a short laugh, not a polite acknowledgement of something he'd disagree with in a moment. It was the full, open-throated laugh of a man who has heard something he finds genuinely absurd. Two of the men at the table smiled. One looked away. A younger operator near the end, Donovan would later learn his name was Lucas Hale, didn't react at all. He was watching her the way someone watches a card trick, not sure yet whether they're about to be impressed or deceived. "Where'd you pull that from?" Barrett said. "The manual for instructors who've never actually run Overwatch in the field." Claire looked at him for exactly 1 second. From watching what happens at 07:40 on an east-facing ridge when the temperature differential between the valley floor and the rock face exceeds 12 degrees. It's not complicated physics, but it does require standing there. And you've stood there. I've stood in worse. Barrett turned to Mercer with an expression that was almost theatrical, the exaggerated patience of a man performing certainty for an audience. "Commander, I want to be respectful here. I genuinely do. But headquarters has sent us a Marine instructor to observe a Tier 1 Overwatch evaluation. And she's arguing to redesign our operational positioning based on what morning thermals." Mercer said nothing. Barrett pressed forward. "With respect to Staff Sergeant Donovan and whatever they're teaching at Quantico these days, this unit has run mountain Overwatch in conditions that would have dissolved a standard team. I don't think we need to reorganize around a lesson from the classroom." The word classroom landed with the weight Barrett intended it to. It sat in the room like something thrown. Claire didn't pick it up. She said, "If I'm wrong, you lose 20 minutes repositioning after the evaluation's already compromised. If I'm right and you ignore it, you run the entire exercise with degraded visibility and call whatever results you get a valid assessment." Mercer looked at her for a long moment. His expression was unreadable in the specific way that experienced commanders make it, unreadable not blank, but controlled. Like he was processing something he hadn't decided yet whether to take seriously. "We'll proceed as planned," he said. "We can reassess positioning at 07:30 if conditions warrant." It was not an agreement. It wasn't quite a dismissal either. It was the kind of military decision that keeps all doors open while clearly indicating which one you intend to walk through. Claire nodded once and picked up her assignment folder. Barrett watched her do it with an expression she'd seen before, on faces that had never had to work very hard to be believed. He wasn't cruel. She understood that, even then. He was simply a man who had spent so long inside a system that confirmed his worth that he'd forgotten confirmation wasn't the same as truth. She didn't say anything else that evening. She found her quarters, unpacked her case with the precise, unhurried movements of someone performing a routine so familiar it required no thought, and spent an hour on the floor of her room, reviewing aerial photographs of the mining complex that would serve as the backdrop for tomorrow's exercise. There was something in those photographs that's bothering her. She couldn't name it yet. But in her experience, unnamed things that bother you during preparation have a way of becoming named things that define outcomes. She filed it away and slept. Morning came cold and clear, the particular Montana clarity that feels like the air has been filtered overnight and returned too clean for human lungs. Claire was at the range before anyone else. She walked the ground at the base of the eastern ridge while the sky was still the color of iron, felt the stillness of it, felt the way the temperature moved differently in the shadow of the ridge than it did 20 meters out, where the valley exhaled its first breath of warming air. At 06:50, the team assembled. Barrett arrived with the self-possession of a man walking onto his own stage. The unit formed up with the efficiency of people who had done this so many times that formation had become automatic, less a conscious act than a gravity. They geared up. They checked equipment. They moved with the quiet competence of a team that knows exactly what it is. Claire stood at the secondary position, a flat overlook 40 meters south of the main range, and watched. The evaluation began precisely at 0700. 5 targets at varying ranges, the furthest stretching to 900 yards, each positioned among the rusted structures of the old mine complex pipe housings, timber frames, the collapsed shell of what had once been a processing building. Barrett shot first as the primary marksman. He was exceptional. There was no other word for it. His form was economical. His adjustments between shots were minimal and precise, and when he engaged the furthest target at 900 yards, the result was so clean, it produced an audible reaction from the team, a brief, sharp exhalation of shared professional admiration. He turned from the position with the easy confidence of a man who has already won. The range officer called Claire forward. The rifle she was handed had been set up the night before by the range staff. It was a standard precision rifle, military issue, the same platform she'd qualified on. She ran her hands along it in the way she always did, not performatively. Not for the benefit of anyone watching, but because touch communicates things that visual inspection misses. She felt the stock, the trigger guard, the bolt, the scope housing. She found it within 40 seconds. The scope had been adjusted. Not dramatically, this wasn't sabotage designed to be obvious. It was a subtle drift in the elevation turret, less than a third of a minute of angle, the kind of adjustment that would produce results that looked like shooter error at range. Someone with less experience might never identify it. Someone trying to perform under observation pressure might not catch it until the first shot landed 18 inches low, and they were already inside their own head about what went wrong. She knew immediately that it wasn't maintenance negligence. Maintenance negligence produces random errors. This error was directional and consistent. Someone had deliberately done this. She looked up. Barrett was watching her, with the alert stillness of a man waiting for something he's already set in motion. She set the rifle down without raising it. Barrett said, from behind her, "Problem with the equipment. Instructor?" The others were watching now. Mercer stood 20 meters back, arms at his sides. Claire did not answer Barrett. She turned her attention to the range in front of her. She was not looking at the targets. She was watching the grass at the base of the mine structure, the way it moved, the direction, the speed. She was watching a cluster of dried leaves caught in the angle between two timber supports, the pattern of their movement, the intervals. She was watching a dust devil forming at the far left edge of the valley floor, small enough to miss, distinctive enough to be useful. She was watching a group of birds, small, fast mountain sparrows, and the way they adjusted their flight path as they crested the ridge 200 meters down. 40 seconds passed. Barrett said, "You're burning range time." Another 30 seconds. "You afraid of a bad shot in front of the team?" 60 more seconds. She could feel the quality of the attention behind her, shifting from impatient amusement into something slightly less certain. People who are waiting for the outcome they expect tend to get uncomfortable when the moment extends beyond what they've planned for. She finally raised the rifle. She fired 2 shots in rapid succession. Neither one hit the visible targets. The laughter that broke out behind her was immediate, bright, sharp, the particular laughter of men who have been waiting for permission to express what they've already decided. Someone said something she didn't catch. Someone else said the word she'd expected. Instructor. Then the range officer's voice cut through. "Hold," the officer said. Pause. "Sergeant Wallace, confirm positions on sensor grid B and C." Another pause. "Sir, grid sensors B and C are down." Physical impact on the sensor housings. The laughter stopped. Claire said, without turning around, "Those sensors were producing false wind readings at ranges beyond 600 yards. The data they were feeding was adding 11 inches of drift correction in the wrong direction. Anyone shooting with that sensor data as a crosswind reference would have missed a 900 target regardless of their form." She felt the shift in the air behind her, not in temperature, in attention. "Third shot," she said, and fired. 900 yards away, in the center of a target buried among the shadow and metal of the old processing structure, a hole appeared where there had been nothing. Nobody laughed this time. She lowered the rifle, turned, and handed it to the range officer. "The elevation turret on this rifle has been drifted approximately 0.3 minutes of angle low. It should be re-zeroed before the next evaluation." She said it like a maintenance note, like it was a fact that deserved to be recorded and nothing more. But her eyes found Barrett's as she said it, and he knew she could see it immediately that she knew. Not suspected, knew. Mercer stepped forward. His face was still composed, but beneath the composure, something was working. Through him, a recognition that didn't yet have the words to name itself. The way you feel when something you should have noticed earlier is suddenly obvious. He said, "That's an unusual approach to a degraded equipment situation." Claire said, "A shooter who fires bad data through good form produces confident misses. I'd rather be uncertain and correct than certain and wrong." "You could have reported the equipment fault before shooting." "Yes, sir." But then we'd only know the rifle was miscalibrated. Now we also know the wind sensors were compromised, and we know that the overwatch position performs within acceptable parameters until approximately 0742, when the thermal distortion begins affecting sight picture at ranges beyond 700 yards. Mercer looked at her for a long moment. She held the look the same way she'd held the rifle, without drama, without impatience, without anything that resembled a performance. He said, observer status. For now, it wasn't what she'd earned. She knew that. He knew that. Every man on the range knew that. But she also understood that trust built through evidence, rather than rank or reputation, is the only kind that holds when everything goes wrong. And she had learned, in the particular and painful way that people learn the most important things, that everything eventually goes wrong. She returned to the secondary position. Barrett was quiet in a way he hadn't been all morning. The younger operator, Hale, walked past her and said, under his breath and without turning his head, "That was a hell of a shooting lesson." She didn't respond. But she noticed he said shooting lesson, not instructor demonstration. There is a difference, and he knew it. The afternoon moved in the direction that afternoons at high-elevation training facilities tend to move heavy with procedure, dense with the kind of professional activity that looks different from the outside than it feels from the inside. The team ran communications drills. They reviewed breach protocols. They studied a projected terrain map of the mine complex that would serve as the setting for the following morning's rescue simulation. Claire sat in the back of the briefing room and studied the aerial photographs she'd been working through the night before. The thing that had been bothering her was beginning to take shape. She pulled out the 3 photographs she'd flagged and laid them side by side on the surface of her folded jacket. The first was the access road that ran along the northwestern face of the mine complex, officially designated as non-operational, its surface showing 18 months of mountain growth. Weeds pushing through the gravel, grass establishing itself along the shoulders. Except in the photograph taken 3 days ago, there was no grass along the left shoulder of the final 200 meters. The surface was clean. And if you weren't specifically looking for the difference between old growth and recent clearing, you wouldn't see it. Someone had used that road recently. The second photograph showed 3 of the mine's ventilation shafts, visible as circular openings in the ridge. Standard thermal imaging showed them as the ambient temperature of the surrounding rock and soil. Except the one designated as Shaft 7 was running 4 degrees Celsius above the ambient. Shaft 7 wasn't on the mine's original operational maps. The third photograph showed the ridge east of the main complex, where the geological survey from 2 years ago had marked a fault line running below the primary tunnel access. The survey recommended the tunnel entrance be structurally reinforced or closed. Nothing on the current operational plan acknowledged this. She set the photographs back in her folder and looked at the front of the room, where the briefing officer was detailing the simulated hostage position and the planned ingress route. The planned ingress route ran directly over the primary tunnel access. She thought about how to raise this without again sounding like an instructor who has memorized a manual about things she hasn't lived through. The morning had created a different baseline. The thing with the sensors, the thing with the rifle, those were specific, verifiable, demonstrable. What she was looking at now was a pattern. And patterns are harder to present to people who haven't learned to see them. She raised her hand. Mercer looked at her from the front of the room. The access road on the northwestern face, she said, the non-operational one. The shoulder vegetation on the final 200 meters has been recently cleared. Someone has used that road within the last 3 days. The briefing officer clicked to a different slide. Our reconnaissance didn't flag any recent activity on that route. The reconnaissance was looking for vehicle tracks and human movement. The clearing is visible in the vegetation pattern, not in the surface material. The road was used, but carefully. Mercer said, noted. What's your assessment? If someone wanted to pre-position assets inside that complex before an operation using it as a training environment, that road is how they do it. The main access is watched. The northwestern route is dismissed as non-functional. Barrett said, from his position at the left side of the table, this is a training exercise. Who's pre-positioning assets in a simulated environment? Nobody if our intelligence is right, Claire said. Our intelligence is right. Then the vegetation pattern was cleared by mountain weather or animals, and everything's fine. The room was quiet for a moment, with the specific quiet of people who aren't sure whether they've just witnessed a reasonable exchange or an argument that ended before it could become one. Mercer said, I'll have reconnaissance take a second pass at the northern road. Briefing continues. It was the same answer he'd given about the morning thermals. Not wrong. Not dismissive. Just the answer of a man who was willing to check, but not willing to reorganize his operation around a pattern he couldn't yet verify. Claire understood. She was used to being understood to a point, and then left at the edge of that point with nowhere to put what she still knew. She also understood that sometimes the edge of what people are willing to believe is exactly where the danger begins. That evening, after the briefing ended and the teams dispersed, she walked out to the far edge of the facility's observation deck and stood in the dark looking at the mountain. The mine complex was invisible at this distance, absorbed into the general darkness of the ridgeline, but she knew where it was. She could feel the shape of it in the aerial photographs she'd memorized. She thought about the ventilation shaft, 4 degrees above ambient. That didn't happen from natural processes in a closed system. That happened from heat. And heat in a sealed shaft came from equipment, or from people. She thought about the geological fault, running beneath the primary tunnel entrance. She thought about the weight of a Tier 1 SEAL team moving at operational pace across that entrance. She thought about Syria. She didn't let herself think about it often or long. But she thought about it now, the particular quality of darkness in the northern desert, the way a sandstorm reduces the world to what you can reach with your hand, the absolute stillness required to take a shot under those conditions, and the specific calculation she'd made in that stillness. Not the calculation of angle and windage and distance, though those were real. The other calculation, the moral one. The one that asked, what is the cost of this shot? And can I bear it? And does the outcome justify the bearing of it? She'd made that calculation and fired. And then her name had been removed from the record. And the men she'd saved had spent 4 years, assuming an accident had intervened on their behalf. She understood why Mercer didn't fully trust her. She understood the logic of institutional skepticism, the way organizations protect themselves by doubting what they can't verify. She'd lived inside those institutions long enough to know their rhythms. What she couldn't fully understand, what she'd spent years turning over in the dark hours of her mind, was how a system sophisticated enough to produce Barrett's extraordinary marksmanship could be crude enough to look at everything she'd done and see only the parts that made it uncomfortable. She was still looking at the mountain when she heard boots on the deck behind her. She turned. It was Lucas Hale, the younger operator, who'd watched her on the range that morning with the particular attention of someone trying to understand something rather than confirm something. He stood a few feet from her and looked at the same mountain she'd been looking at. The sensor thing, he said after a moment. The way you identified those before you fired. How long did that take you? Reading them? About 4 minutes. We were told the sensor grid was checked that morning. It was checked by someone who assumed it was working correctly. You check differently when you're assuming error. Hale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Barrett calibrated your rifle. I didn't know until you called it. But when you said it, I remembered him at the rifle stand the night before. I thought he was running a maintenance check. The information didn't surprise her. The shape of it had been clear, since she'd felt the turret drift under her thumb. But something about Hale saying it voluntarily, without being asked, in the dark where nobody could see him doing it, made her look at him differently. She said, why are you telling me? He looked at her for a moment. Because when I was a candidate, a senior instructor told me that team integrity starts before the operation does. And I've been trying to decide all day whether what I saw last night qualifies as a team integrity problem, or just Barrett being Barrett. She said, what did you decide? He looked back at the mountain. I decided I'd rather tell someone who could do something about it than stay quiet and find out later that it mattered. She considered that. Then she said, go get some sleep, Hale. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. He nodded. He was halfway back to the door when she said, without turning around, thank you. He stopped for a moment, then continued walking. She stayed on the deck for another hour, looking at the dark mountain. Somewhere in that darkness, a ventilation shaft was running 4 degrees above ambient. Somewhere in that darkness, a geological fault ran beneath the only approved ingress route. Somewhere in that darkness, a road that nobody was supposed to be using showed evidence of recent use. She pressed each of these facts against the shape of what she knew about people who want to be invisible in the right place at the right time. And the shape they made together was something cold and specific, not a training scenario, a trap. She went inside and sent a single encrypted message to the secure line she'd been given for mission-critical observations. Then she reviewed the aerial photographs one more time, made 3 annotations in her field notebook, and prepared her equipment for a morning that she already understood would not resemble anyone else's plans for it. In the room next to hers, she could hear Barrett moving restless. She guessed, from the pattern of the sounds. Not sleeping, thinking. She hoped he was thinking about the right things. She suspected he wasn't. At 06:15 the next morning, before the team had finished breakfast, the emergency alert reached Commander Mercer's secure terminal. The exercise designation had changed. Exercise Ridgeback was no longer classified as training. Dr. Rebecca Sloan, a civilian systems engineer with Level 3 clearance attached to the Gallatin Defense Research Site, 11 miles northeast, had been reported missing from her quarters at 11:47 the previous night. Her access card had been used to exit the research site at 11:52. Preliminary analysis of facility surveillance showed she had not left voluntarily. She had been taken, and the individual identified in connection with her disappearance through partial facial recognition at the facility perimeter and a flagged communication intercept was Mason Rourke, former private defense contractor, currently wanted on weapons transfer violations across 3 federal jurisdictions. The mine complex on the ridge above the training facility was no longer a simulated rescue environment. It was where they believed Rebecca Sloan was being held. Mercer read the briefing summary 3 times, then walked to the center of the room where his team was assembling. He said, "This is no longer an exercise. We have a live hostage situation. We have an armed group in an environment we have partial intelligence on. We have a 6-hour window before a satellite transmission window opens that Rourke intends to use to upload stolen targeting software." He paused. "We go in with what we have and what we know." Barrett said, "Immediately, primary ingress, northeast tunnel access. We move at speed, we maintain communication discipline. We extract the hostage and the equipment." Mercer looked at Claire. She was standing at the back of the room, her field notebook open. Her expression the specific neutral that experienced people wear when they know something they haven't been asked yet. Secondary overwatch. Not primary. Not operational. Secondary. She said nothing else, because she understood that the time for patterns and photographs and politely flagged concerns had just run out. What mattered now was position. And from her secondary overwatch position, nearly a mile from the primary ingress point, she would have the clearest view of everything, including, she calculated, everything that was about to go wrong. The team began moving toward the mountain in the long morning light, spreading out along the valley approach in the kind of practiced formation that spoke fluently of years and miles and things endured together. Claire walked her separate route, faster, higher. She was already on the ridge when they reached the valley floor. She was already in position when she saw the first thing that didn't belong, a reflection, brief and sharp, from the edge of the northwestern access road, the road that nobody was supposed to be using. She pressed her eye to the scope and found the shape of what was waiting. And she understood with the cold clarity of someone who has already lived through exactly this kind of moment that the operation was about to become something very different from what anyone on the team had planned for. She pressed the transmit button on her radio. "Commander," she said, "stop the team." There was a pause. Then Barrett's voice, tight with the velocity of a man already moving. "Donovan, we are executing a live hostage extraction. Unless you have a confirmed target, maintain your position and maintain radio discipline. There are armed personnel on the northwestern access road," she said. "At least 4, possibly 6. They are above your approach vector. You are walking into an ambush." Another pause, shorter. Then Mercer's voice. "Donovan, can you confirm the threat assessment?" She looked through the scope at the shape of the shadows on the northwestern road, at the way the morning light was falling wrong on the edges of the mine entrance. At the position of the man she could see clearly now, prone behind the crest of the ridge, with a radio pressed to his ear. She said, "Commander, the mine entrance is covered. The primary tunnel approach is already bracketed. If your team reaches the valley mouth, they will be inside the kill zone before anyone has a firing solution." A long pause, then Barrett, "She's reading shadows. We proceed on plan." And Mercer, after a moment that lasted longer than it should have, "Proceed on plan. Donovan, maintain overwatch." She lowered the radio. She put her eye back to the scope. She watched the team move into the valley below, and she began the precise, methodical, heartbreaking work of preparing to do what nobody had yet given her permission to do, while the clock above her ran forward. and the trap below her waited, and the mountain held its cold breath for what was coming. She watched them move into the valley and felt something she had no word for, not fear, because fear would have paralyzed her, and she was the opposite of paralyzed. It was closer to grief, the grief of knowing exactly what is about to happen and not being able to stop it from the position you've been assigned. The team was good. She had to give them that. They moved with the kind of disciplined silence that only comes from years of doing this together, the specific coordination of a unit that has learned to breathe as one organism. Barrett on point, Mercer 2 positions back, Hale on the left flank. 4 other operators spread across the valley approach in a formation that would have been exactly correct if the intelligence had been exactly right. It wasn't. She counted the shadows on the northwestern ridge again. Not 4, not 6, 8, and they weren't positioned to fire down into the valley. They were positioned to fire across it laterally, covering the escape routes. This wasn't a defensive position protecting the mine entrance. This was a containment perimeter designed to cut off retreat after the team committed to the approach. Whoever had set this up had studied how Tier 1 units move into an objective. They'd studied it carefully enough to know that the first response to contact would be to push forward or fall back along the approach axis. And they'd eliminated both options before the first shot was fired. She pressed the transmit button. Command, this is Donovan. I am looking at 8 confirmed hostile positions on the northwestern ridge. They are not covering the mine entrance. They are covering the egress routes. This is a containment formation. I say again, this is not a defense. This is a trap. Static. Then Barrett's voice, clipped and cold. Donovan, you are compromising radio discipline on an active approach. Unless you have eyes on a weapon being raised, stand down your assessment and maintain overwatch. Chief Barrett, stand down, Sergeant. She pulled back from the transmit button, looked through the scope. Watched the team reach the base of the valley where the ground narrowed between 2 rock faces, the natural choke point, before the mine's primary tunnel entrance. Exactly where the intelligence plan had said they would pass through. Exactly where she would have placed a trigger if she were setting this up. 40 meters, 30-20. She exhaled. The ground moved. Not dramatically, not the Hollywood version of an explosion that fills the sky. It was a deep, structural sound, almost below the range of hearing, felt more in the chest than the ears. The primary tunnel entrance buckled inward. The earth above it shifted 3 feet to the left. A section of the approach path dropped 18 inches as the geological fault she'd flagged in the photographs finally received the weight it had been waiting for. The team scattered on instinct, good instinct, the right instinct, but there was nowhere to scatter to. The choke point was collapsing behind them. The walls of the valley were suddenly full of movement as the 8 positions she'd counted came alive. Barrett's voice hit the radio. Contact. Contact left, we have armed static. The communications disruption came next, so fast and so complete that it told her the jamming equipment had been pre-positioned and triggered on command. Someone had been watching a monitor somewhere, waiting for the team to reach exactly this coordinate before pressing a button. She had 9 seconds of broken transmission before the channel went to white noise. In those 9 seconds, she heard 3 things. Barrett calling for covering fire. Mercer's voice, steady in a way that must have him something, giving a rally point. And Hale, one sharp, involuntary sound that wasn't a word. The kind of sound a person makes when something heavy impacts something that shouldn't be impacted. Then silence. She was already moving before the silence finished settling. Not down toward the valley that would accomplish nothing, except adding herself to the list of people who needed help. Up. Along the ridge to the secondary elevation she'd identified that morning before anyone else was awake, the position that was 40 meters higher than her current overwatch, and gave her a visual angle that the primary position didn't have. She moved fast. The way you move when you've stopped calculating the cost of speed against the cost of caution because the calculation has already resolved itself. She'd learned this in places she didn't talk about, that there is a moment in every deteriorating situation when hesitation becomes indistinguishable from surrender. And the only thing left to do is move toward the problem and trust what you know. She reached the secondary position in 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Set up in another 40. Put her eye to the scope and spent exactly 1 minute reading the new situation below her. What she saw was not chaos, though it looked like chaos from any angle that didn't have the elevation she had. It was controlled pressure. Rourke's men were not trying to kill the team, not yet. They were pushing them, herding them into the lower level of the mine complex, through a secondary entrance on the eastern face, one that hadn't appeared on any operational plan because it was a later addition, post-construction, cut through the rock sometime in the past 18 months. Someone had been planning this for a long time. She found Barrett through the scope. He'd lost his long-range optics. The scope housing on his rifle was visibly damaged, probably from the collapsed debris. He was firing on instinct and proximity, relying on iron sights at ranges that demanded magnification. And the crosswinds at the valley base were doing exactly what she'd told Mercer they would do, to accuracy at this elevation and this time of morning. His shots were honest. They were also landing 18 to 24 inches off. She found Mercer next. He was at the rear of the team's collapsing formation, doing the work of a commander, rather than an operator keeping men moving, keeping them from fragmenting, holding the team together by will rather than plan. She'd read enough of his file to understand that this was his particular genius. He could not be rattled by circumstances, only by questions. She found Hale on the eastern edge of the formation. He was down. Not dead, she could see the shallow rise and fall of his breathing through the scope, but his left leg was pinned under a section of collapsed mine timber, and he was not moving it, and the angle it was sitting at told her it was not a simple bruise. Then she found the radio operator, one of Rourke's men, positioned at the high point of the eastern face with a handheld transmitter pressed to his jaw. She could see his mouth moving, could see the way he was tracking the team's position and relaying it in real time to someone she couldn't see. She could take him. Clean shot, adjustable for the crosspin, now that she'd had time to read it properly. But taking the radio operator went nowhere useful unless she could simultaneously communicate with Mercer, and communications were jammed, and she had no way to tell him what she was seeing from up here, which meant every adjustment she made from this position would be invisible to the people it was designed to help. She needed to think differently. She'd been trained formally, institutionally, to think in terms of targets. Identify the target, establish the shot solution, eliminate the threat, move to the next. It was clean logic. It worked in environments that cooperated with clean logic. Most environments didn't. She began working the problem from the other direction. Not what do I shoot, what do I change? Through the scope, she studied the mind complex with the total attention of someone who has learned that the right answer is always in the details that other people have already dismissed. She found it in 7 minutes. Not one thing, a chain of things, connected to each other the way pressure points in a body are connected, where applying force to the right location changes everything downstream. 3 elements. She needed to address them in the right sequence. While she was identifying the sequence, a voice broke through the jamming on the emergency override channel, the one that bypassed conventional communications equipment and ran on a frequency that required specialized hardware to block. She'd been given the override code before she left for Montana. She hadn't told anyone she had it. The voice was Colonel Vaughn. She recognized it immediately, not from her official briefing, but from 4 years ago, from a different mountain in a different country, from a radio pressed to her ear in a sandstorm while she was doing the math on a shot that should have been impossible. Donovan, Vaughn said. I see your beacon status. Team is contained in the Eastern Valley approach. Mercer's unit is being pushed toward the mine's secondary entrance. Rourke is in the complex. I have 1 team member down with what appears to be a leg injury. I have a visual on the battlefield, but no communication with the team. Can you reestablish comms? Not directly. The jamming is hardware-based and ground level. But I can give the team visual signals if I can get them looking at the right part of the ridge. What do you need? Authority to engage targets of opportunity outside the conventional threat list. A pause. Not a long one. Vaughn was not the kind of person who needed long pauses to make decisions. You have it. Whatever you need to do, Donovan. One more thing, Colonel. Go ahead. Rourke set this up specifically because he knows how Mercer's team operates. He's watched them. This isn't improvised. He had someone on the inside giving him operational intelligence about this exercise. Another pause, shorter. I know, Vaughn said. We're working on it. Right now, your job is to get those people out of there. We'll handle the rest. The channel went quiet. Not jammed, just empty. The way a line goes empty when the person on the other end has said what needed to be said and trusted you to do the rest. She looked through the scope again. Mercer's team had been pushed 70 meters into the eastern approach. They were behind cover, good cover, a natural rock formation that the SEALs had found instinctively, but the cover was temporary. Rourke's men had the high ground and they knew it. The pressure would intensify in minutes. She made her first decision. The jamming equipment's power source was a generator. She'd identified it by its heat signature, a warm patch against the cold rock on the upper eastern face. She couldn't destroy it with a direct shot without potentially triggering a cascade failure that would send the power pack downslope toward the team. But she could damage the transmitter array rather than the power source, which would degrade the jamming without eliminating it, creating a window in the interference narrow enough to miss if you didn't know it was there, and wide enough to push a short burst transmission through if you timed it precisely. She fired once. The transmitter array housing fractured. Not destroyed, fractured. She pressed the override channel button and said, "Mercer, 40-second window. Respond." 3 seconds of static. Then Mercer's voice, rough and tight and absolutely controlled. "Donovan, talk. You have 8 hostile positions on the northwest ridge above you. They're covering your egress, not your front. Rourke is in the complex with the hostage and the transmission equipment. I have a visual on his relay operator at the high point of the eastern face. Hale is down, he's breathing. Leg is pinned. He needs to be moved before the pressure changes. Do not use the primary tunnel. Do not use the secondary eastern entrance, it's covered. There is a third access point, maintenance shaft on the south face, marked on the original survey as shaft 7. It's been used recently. It goes directly into the lower level of the complex." A pause that contained about 6 different things at once. "How do you know about the maintenance shaft?" "Aerial photographs, thermal variants, and the fact that someone has been using that road on the northwestern face to bring equipment in for at least 3 weeks." Another pause. "You told me that yesterday." "Yes, sir, I did." She heard him process this not with words, but with the quality of the silence that followed. The specific silence of a man recalibrating something fundamental. "Your window is closing," she said. "Can you suppress the northwest ridge long enough for us to move Hale and reposition?" "Not suppress. But I can redirect their attention for approximately 90 seconds. That's enough. We'll move on your signal." "Understood. Stand by." She had 30 seconds before the jamming would restore. She used 20 of them to establish exactly what she needed to do and in what sequence. Then she used the remaining 10 to breathe. Not to calm herself, she was already calm. To center the kind of attention that precise shooting at distance requires. The kind that isn't about skill or muscle memory or training, but about the space between breath and trigger that either exists or doesn't. Her first shot hit the electrical junction box at the base of the northwestern ridge's center position, not the men, the infrastructure. The flood of sparks and the sharp crack of shorting equipment produced exactly what she needed. Sudden, involuntary attention from every position on that ridge, all of it directed upward toward the electrical failure rather than downward toward the valley. 90 seconds. She didn't wait to confirm. She moved her aim left, to the upper edge of the approach, where a section of mining pipe had been repurposed as a makeshift barrier by 2 of Rourke's men who were using it to channel the team's movement toward the secondary entrance. She fired at the bracket holding the pipe in place, not the pipe itself. The bracket gave. The pipe swung. The 2 men scrambled backward instinctively, creating a gap in the barrier that hadn't been there before, a gap that ran almost directly toward the south face of the complex, toward shaft 7. Below her, she saw the team move. Fast. Coordinated. 2 men to Hale, lifting him between them with the practiced efficiency of people who have carried each other before and knew exactly how much each other could bear. Mercer directing the flow of movement without raising his voice above what was necessary, which she couldn't hear but could see in the controlled urgency of the unit's response to him. Barrett was covering the movement, working the damaged optic on his rifle with the frustrated competence of a man who refuses to be less effective than his equipment allows, compensating for the scope damage with adjustments that were too fast and too instinctive to be anything but years of practice. He was still 18 inches off at distance, but close enough to force Rourke's men to keep their heads down, and that was enough. The 90 seconds ended. The jamming restored. The team disappeared around the southern face of the complex. She exhaled. Then a new voice hit the radio, not the override channel, but the stolen operational frequency that Rourke's men had been using. Male flat, with the accent of a man who'd spent years in private contracting and had learned to scrub his voice of anything that could identify him. "You have moved your team, Commander. Congratulations on the creativity. However, I want you to understand the parameters of your current situation clearly." Rourke. She found him through the scope in 4 seconds. He was at the upper level of the mine complex, visible, through one of the structural openings that had been an original mine window, now empty of glass, framing him at a range that her instrument told her was 940 yards. He had a radio in one hand. In the other hand, he held what she recognized immediately as a backup transmitter, smaller than the primary relay. Portable, the kind of unit that could push an upload through a narrow satellite window if you were within range. He was within range. The satellite window opened in 2 hours and 14 minutes. Dr. Sloan is with us, Rourke continued, over the stolen frequency. She is unharmed, and she will remain that way so long as your team makes no further movement toward the complex. If I see another attempt to access the facility, I will begin the upload immediately, and I will stop caring about Dr. Sloan's continued comfort. I want your surrender confirmation in 10 minutes. She heard Barrett's voice somehow, impossibly, on a frequency that shouldn't have reached her position, broken and partial through the jamming degradation she'd created. Not going to happen. And Mercer, quieter, harder, 10 minutes buys us time. We acknowledge and we plan. She was already planning. Rourke at 940 yards through a structural opening, approximately 30 by 20 inches. Wind reading at her current elevation, 12 knots, variable from the southwest. Temperature differential between the ambient air and the rock face, 9 degrees, which meant the thermal effects she'd predicted yesterday morning were fully operational and would affect any conventional shot at this range by approximately 15 to 20 inches of drift. The opening was protected on its left side by a section of mining equipment, a rusted ore hopper that had been there since the 1950s, and would stop a rifle round with absolute certainty. She could not take the shot, not because of the wind, not because of the range. She'd made longer shots in worse conditions. She couldn't take the shot because Rourke had positioned himself deliberately, intelligently 6 feet from a wall of unstable mining explosive. Old charges, decades past their safe storage life, degraded and unpredictable. A miss would be catastrophic. A hit on Rourke at that position, depending on the round's exit path, could trigger a detonation that would bring the upper level of the complex down. The team was moving through Shaft 7 directly below the upper level. She could not shoot Rourke. She needed to change what she was shooting at. She worked the problem. Quickly, but not frantically. There is a difference. And it matters. Because the solutions that come from panic are rarely solutions, and the ones that come from disciplined speed occasionally are. She studied the geometry of the upper level, as she understood it from the aerial photographs, the mine's original survey, and the thermal data she'd analyzed. The backup transmitter required line of sight to the satellite relay point. The relay point was on the eastern ridge. She'd identified it when she'd first reached the secondary position. It was a dish, relatively small, mounted on a survey tripod that had no business being in this location unless someone had placed it there specifically for this operation. She couldn't reach Rourke, but she could take the relay dish. 810 yards. Easier shot than Rourke's position. Except the relay dish was a small target, and destroying it might prompt Rourke to move to a new relay location rather than accepting defeat, and she didn't know how many relay points he'd pre-positioned. She needed more information. She found his radio operator again, the man at the high point of the eastern face. He was still transmitting, still updating someone on the team's movements. But now, watching him with the patience the scope demanded, she saw something she hadn't caught before, the direction of his antenna. He was transmitting to the relay dish, not to a secondary location. To one fixed point, there was only one relay. She moved her aim to the relay dish. Establish the shot solution. Read the wind twice, cross-referencing the grass movement at the base of the eastern ridge with the bird flight pattern she'd been tracking for the past 30 minutes. She paused because she just thought of something. If she destroyed the relay dish now before the team was in position inside the complex, Rourke would know immediately that his transmission capability was gone, and he would know the shot came from an overwatch position, and he would know that the overwatch position was on the upper ridge. He would relocate. He would also, she calculated, move Rebecca immediately to a position that was less exposed. She needed to wait. She needed to wait until the team was in position, and she could take the relay and Rourke simultaneously, not simultaneously, in terms of 2 shots at once, but in terms of a sequence fast enough that Rourke couldn't respond between them, which meant she needed to reestablish communication with Mercer, which meant she needed to create another window in the jamming, which meant firing again at the transmitter array she'd already damaged, but more precisely this time, damaging a second component that would widen the interference gap from 40 seconds to something closer to 2 minutes. She moved her aim back to the transmitter array, found the second component, the signal amplifier housing, slightly below and left of the first hit, established the solution, fired. This time the gap came instantly. She pressed the override. Mercer, talk to me. His voice came through cleaner than before. Shaft 7 is clear. We're inside the lower level. Hale is mobile with assistance. Barrett's optic is gone. He's working irons. What do you have? Rourke is at the upper level. He has Rebecca and the backup transmitter. He's positioned adjacent to unstable explosives. I cannot take a direct shot. His only relay for the upload is the dish on the eastern ridge. I can take the dish, but I need to time it with your entry to the upper level. If I take the dish before you reach him, he relocates and we lose the advantage. Time to reach the upper level through the shaft? Based on the mine survey, 6 to 8 minutes. We'll move in 4. Commander, 4 minutes, Donovan. What else do I need to know? One more thing, she said. The man covering your position from the eastern face high point. He's Rourke's eyes. He's been tracking your movement and relaying it in real time. He needs to be neutralized before you make the upper level, or Rourke will know you're coming. A pause. Can you reach him from your position? Yes. Confirmed hostile? He's been directing armed personnel against your team for the past 40 minutes while relay tracking a kidnapping victim. Yes, sir. Confirmed hostile. Neutralize him. We move in 4. Copy. The gap in the jamming was closing. She heard it in the static's return, the white noise reasserting itself at the edges of the frequency. She had 30 seconds of clear channel left, and she used 10 of them. Mercer, she said. When you reach Rourke, do not engage until I signal. I need a coordinated window. If you go early, he uploads before I can take the relay. Understood signal. You'll know, she said. It'll be the loudest thing on the mountain. The channel went to static. She had 4 minutes. She moved to the eastern face high point, not physically, but in the scope, finding the radio operator with the practiced patience of someone who has learned that speed and hurry are not the same thing. He was still there, still transmitting. She read the wind one more time, established the solution, made the adjustment for the 9-degree temperature differential. She waited until he raised the antenna for his next transmission burst. Waited because the antenna raise gave her a reference point for his exact position that his head alone didn't provide. The antenna rose. She fired. The radio operator went down, and the transmission went silent. And somewhere in the complex below her, Rourke was now blind. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She moved her aim to the relay dish on the eastern ridge. Confirmed the solution. Did not fire. Waited. 2 minutes. She heard not over the radio, but through the physical transmission of sound, through mountain rock, the way sound travels differently in geological formations than it does in open air, the distant, muffled movement of people in the lower level of the complex. The team. Moving 1 minute. She watched the upper level window where she'd last seen Rourke. He was still there. But he'd moved slightly closer to Rebecca, she realized. He could feel the operation changing around him, even without his radio operator's updates. Men who've spent years in operational environments develop a sensitivity to the texture of silence that functions almost like a second set of eyes. He was feeling the wrong kind of quiet, and he was pulling the hostage close in response. 30 seconds. The explosion of activity from the upper level came without announcement. The team had made it through the shaft in 3 minutes and 50 seconds, not 4, because Mercer had taken the 4-minute estimate as a ceiling rather than a target. The sound of entry was unmistakable even at this distance, the particular kinetic percussion of trained operators making forced contact with a fortified position. Rourke spun toward the sound. His arm came up with the backup transmitter. Claire fired at the relay dish. The dish came apart in a burst of metal and broken optics. Rourke pressed the transmit button. Nothing happened. He pressed it again. His face, visible through the scope, went through 3 expressions in approximately 2 seconds: confusion, understanding, and then the cold, calculating look of a man shifting immediately from plan A to plan B without wasting emotional energy on the transition between them. He shoved Rebecca toward a man on his left and moved toward the back of the upper level room, toward the unstable explosives wall, toward the area that made any direct shot catastrophic. He was going deeper into the complex. He was going to find another relay, another path, another way. She heard Barrett's voice on the stolen frequency, still broken, still partial. But clear enough, he's moving northeast tunnel. We can't follow him without triggering. She understood the unstable explosives, the geological fault. The northeast tunnel ran directly through the zone that was structurally compromised. If the team followed Rourke into it at any pace above a careful walk, the vibration alone could destabilize the old charges. And Rourke knew it. He was using his knowledge of the mine's structure as a shield, moving into the one area where the team couldn't follow quickly enough to matter. And she still could not shoot him directly. She moved her aim to the northeast tunnel entrance, not to the man, not to the explosives, not to anything that would create the catastrophe everyone was trying to avoid. She looked at the infrastructure of the tunnel entrance itself, the original mine design, the way the ore gate was mounted on its track system, decades of rust and mountain cold, having worked on the hinges until they were held by a single locking bracket. A single locking bracket. She found it through the scope. Cast iron, 40 years old, holding 800 pounds of ore gate in the closed position by friction and habit rather than structural integrity. 900 yards. The crosswind was 11 knots now, slightly stronger than before, pulling left. The temperature differential had increased in the past hour as the morning advanced, adding another half-inch of thermal drift to account for. The bracket was approximately 4 inches wide and 3 inches tall. She made every adjustment, checked the solution twice, checked it a third time. Then she thought about Syria, about a chain, about the calculation that wasn't about windage or distance or trigger weight, but about consequences, about the full downstream picture of what happens when the bullet reaches its destination and everything after that moment unfolds. She thought about Rourke walking into that tunnel and emerging somewhere she couldn't see with a backup transmission device and 4 years of careful planning and the absolute confidence of a man who has never once been stopped by the people sent to stop him. She thought about Rebecca, about the team, about Hale on the ground with his leg pinned. She fired. The bracket gave. The ore gate dropped across the tunnel entrance with a sound she felt before she heard a deep, resonant collision of iron against rock that echoed off the mountain face and came back to her across the distance as something between a bell tone and thunder. Rourke was on the wrong side of it, trapped, without triggering the explosives, without bringing the tunnel down, without giving him a path out that the team couldn't control. She lowered the rifle. The mountain was very quiet. Then, through the degraded jamming frequency, she heard Mercer's voice. Calm, unambiguous. 3 words. Her. And then, after a pause that contained more than 3 words could carry, Donovan. Report. She pressed the transmit button. Rourke is contained in the northeast tunnel. Ore gate is down. He can't move the bracket from that side without the right equipment, and he doesn't have it. Relay is destroyed. Backup transmitter has no signal path. Rebecca is secure. Your team is clear. Another pause. Then Mercer said something she hadn't expected. I should have listened to you yesterday. She looked at the mountain, at the smoke from the destroyed relay dish drifting across the eastern ridge, at the stillness that had replaced everything that had just happened, the way stillness always follows the kind of noise that rearranges things. Get your team out safely, Commander, she said. We can talk about the rest when everyone's back on flat ground. She began breaking down her position. Methodical, precise. The same hands that had just fired 4 shots that changed the outcome of everything she'd been watching for the past 2 hours, worked through the breakdown sequence with the same unhurried discipline as always. She was almost done when Barrett's voice hit the frequency, and for the first time since she'd met him, all the performance was gone from it. Just the voice of a man saying a thing he'd needed to say for longer than he'd known. Donovan, a pause. That shot at the bracket, another pause. I've never seen anything like that. She considered not responding. Then she did. I know, she said. That's the problem. She closed the rifle case, latched it, picked it up, and began walking down the mountain toward the aftermath of everything that was about to need to be sorted through the explanations, the debriefs, the accounting that always. She reached the base of the mountain 40 minutes after the ore gate came down, and the first thing she heard when she came around the southern face of the complex was Hale's voice. He was arguing with the medic about whether his leg was broken or just badly bruised, and the medic was losing the argument on volume while clearly winning it on evidence, because Hale's left leg was wrapped from knee to ankle, and he was sitting against a rock face with the particular expression of a man who has decided that pain is an administrative problem rather than a physical one. He saw Claire coming and said, Barrett's looking for you. She said, I know. Mercer too, I know that too. Hale watched her for a moment with the same quality of attention he'd had on the range 2 days ago, the look of someone trying to understand something rather than judge it. Then he said quietly the bracket shot. At 900 yards through a 4-inch target. I was on the radio when it happened. I heard the gate come down. She stopped walking, looked at him. I've been in this unit for 3 years, he said. I've seen Barrett shoot. I've seen some of the best precision work the military produces. I've never heard a shot like that described the way the guys up top described it when they came through the shaft. She said, how'd they describe it? He thought about it for a moment. Like someone had calculated the exact right answer to a question everybody else was too scared to ask. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once and kept walking. The debrief staging area had been set up inside the mine's lower level access, a flat section of ground near Shaft 7's exit where the team had assembled after extracting Rebecca. Portable lighting had been established. A field medic was completing a secondary assessment of the team's injuries. 2 federal agents had arrived by helicopter from the Gallatin research site Fast Response, which told her Vaughn had been moving pieces before the first shot was fired this morning. Rebecca Sloan was sitting on a folded blanket with a thermal wrap around her shoulders and a cup of something hot in both hands. She was not the version of a hostage that movies had trained people to expect. She wasn't shaking, wasn't vacant, wasn't performing trauma for an audience. She was alert and quiet in the way that certain people get when they've been through something and have decided that processing it is a task for later. And the task for right now is getting every relevant detail organized before it starts to blur. She looked up when Claire came through the shaft entrance and said, immediately, you're the one who took the relay dish. It wasn't a question. Claire said yes. And the ore gate. Yes. Rebecca studied her for a moment. He had a secondary transmitter. He'd been planning to use the Eastern relay as the primary and keep a satellite phone as the backup. When the relay went down, he tried the phone. It wasn't working. She paused. I pulled the battery out while he was watching the gate come down. I'd been working on getting to it for about 20 minutes. Claire looked at her. I'm a systems engineer, Rebecca said simply. He brought me along because he thought I could help him resolve a compatibility issue with the targeting software. I let him think that for as long as it was useful. She paused again. I figured that whoever was coming to get me would need every second I could buy them. This was the second time in 2 days that someone had surprised Claire with their quality. She filed it carefully. So did you, Rebecca said. From what I could hear through the upper-level floor, which was a lot. The acoustics in there are extraordinary. You were operating alone on that ridge for most of it. That was the assignment, Rebecca said with a dryness that had survived everything she'd been through remarkably intact. Some assignment. Claire almost smiled. Didn't quite get there, but almost. She heard Mercer's voice from the far end of the staging area steady, directing the federal agents through the incident sequence with the precision of a man who has filed more after-action reports than he can count and has learned to give them in the field before the details start softening at the edges. She moved in that direction, and he saw her coming, and he paused mid-sentence in a way that the federal agents noticed without understanding. He said to the agents, "Give me 3 minutes." They did. He walked toward Claire, and she walked toward him, and they met in the middle of the staging area in the particular way that 2 people meet when they've been circling something important and have both finally run out of open ground. Mercer said, Vaughn briefed me. Partially. Enough. She waited. Syria, he said. He looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Not softness, that wasn't the right word for it. Something more like the look of a man encountering the true shape of a thing he'd been carrying wrong for years, and realizing that the weight wasn't less than he'd thought. It was more because it had belonged to someone else the whole time. Yes, the chain. Yes. He went very still. Not the controlled stillness of command composure, the other kind. The kind that happens to a person when their body understands something before their mind has finished processing it. He stood there for a moment in that stillness, and she let him stand there, because some realizations need the space of a moment to fully arrive. I thought it snapped, he said. The chain. I thought the wind load finally broke it. The suspension on that walkway had been compromised for weeks. Everyone knew it. When it came down between us and the advancing force, every man on my team assumed it was structural failure. We wrote it up as an environmental factor. He paused. I wrote it up. Claire said nothing. How far was the shot? 860 yards. In a sandstorm. Visibility was down to about 40 meters at ground level. I was elevated. It was better higher up. He processed this. Then you were tracking the walkway. I was tracking the load-bearing chain. The walkway itself was too heavy to drop cleanly. It would have come down on your wounded men. The chain connected to the eastern anchor point. Dropping it on that side brought the walkway across the approach path instead of down onto your position. The advancing force couldn't cross it. Your wounded men were protected by it. He looked at her for a long time. You did the physics on that in a sandstorm at 800 yards while my team was taking fire. I did the physics before I took the shot, she said. That's the requirement. The shot is the easy part. Nothing about that shot was easy. The physics was easy, she said. The decision was harder. He understood what she meant. She could see it in the way he received it, not as modesty, not as performance, but as the technical truth it was. The calculation of angle and windage and structural load was solvable. The calculation of whether she had the right to make a choice that would determine whether 8 men lived or died, that was the one that took something from a person that doesn't fully come back. He said, "Why was your record sealed?" Before she could answer, Colonel Vaughn's voice came from the shaft entrance. He had arrived in person, not by radio, and he was moving through the staging area with the purposeful economy of a man who has been running toward this conversation for 4 years and is finally close enough to have it. 61 years old, and built like someone who had been told throughout his career that his job was to make difficult things work, and had taken that mandate literally in every dimension of his life. He'd been Claire's commanding officer during the unit's operational period. He was the only person above her clearance level who had known her full record, and the only person who had fought unsuccessfully, initially, to keep it from being sealed. He walked to where Claire and Mercer were standing, looked at both of them, made a decision about where to start. He said, "Commander Mercer, what I'm about to tell you requires an upgrade to your clearance level, which I am authorizing right now in the field under emergency provisions. Staff Sergeant Donovan cannot be the one to tell you this, because for 4 years the protocol has required that her own record be accessed by someone above her clearance, not below it. The system was designed that way deliberately." Mercer said, "By who?" "By the person who wanted to make sure she couldn't easily defend herself if the truth became inconvenient." A silence settled over the three of them. Vaughn said, 3 years before the Syria mission, Donovan's unit began tracking a series of illegal weapons transfers in the Northern Theater. The transfers were sophisticated, not the kind of operation run by independent actors. Institutional knowledge. Insider access to logistics networks. Someone with clearance was moving military-grade equipment to foreign buyers through a contractor chain that had been specifically constructed to look legitimate on paper. Mercer was listening with the absolute attention of someone who has just realized that the thing he thought was a story about one person is actually a story about something much larger. Donovan's unit identified the contractor chain, Vaughn continued, and they identified the individual coordinating it. Private defense contractor. 15 years of clean federal work as his cover, 8 years of building the secondary network underneath it. Vaughn looked at Claire. "You want to say the name?" She said, "Mason Rourke." The name landed in the staging area the way a stone lands in still water, the impact at the center, and then the rings spreading out, and then the stillness returning, but fundamentally changed. Mercer said quietly, "He was in Syria. He was providing logistics support to the forward operating bases in the northern sector." Vaughn said, "Legitimate contract work. Cover for moving equipment." When Donovan's unit got close enough to the contractor chain to start pulling threads, Rourke leaked her operational position to a contact inside the Syrian network. He expected her to be killed. When she wasn't, when she survived and made it back, he needed a different solution. He had her record sealed, Mercer said. He had it sealed through an intermediary official who believed it was a standard security protocol. The intermediary didn't know why. Rourke fed him a story about a compromised identity protection issue. The seal went through official channels, looked legitimate, and buried her record in a place where it couldn't be accessed without a clearance level she would never have reason to reach. Vaughn paused. And then he made sure she was reassigned to a training position where her operational history would become progressively less credible over time. Every year she spent at Quantico made it easier to dismiss her as someone who knew about shooting but had never really done it. The silence after this was different from the other silences. It had weight in it, the specific weight of a design understood all at once, the way a cage looks obvious from the outside and invisible from within. Mercer turned to Claire. He looked at her with an expression that was trying to be something adequate to the situation, and finding that the situation was larger than most adequate expressions can cover. He said, "You knew all of this." "I knew most of it," she said. "I didn't know the intermediary's identity until Vaughn's team started pulling threads 2 months ago. I knew the pattern. I knew the shape of it. I didn't have the documentation to prove it above the level where it would be taken seriously. And you came here anyway, to this exercise, knowing Rourke might be connected to it. I came because Vaughn asked me to, and because the aerial photographs of the mine complex showed activity consistent with what I'd been tracking for 3 years. And because she stopped," Mercer said. She looked at him directly. "Because when someone takes 4 years of your life and buries it to protect themselves, you don't wait for the right moment to correct the record. You find the moment when you can do something useful with it and you go." Barrett's voice came from behind her. She hadn't heard him approach. He'd been standing at the edge of the staging area, close enough to have heard most of this, and the version of Owen Barrett who spoke now was not the version she'd encountered in the briefing room 2 days ago. The performance was entirely gone. What was left was a man who'd just been handed a mirror he hadn't asked for. He said, "Donovan." She turned. He was standing with his rifle case in one hand and his damaged scope in the other, and he looked like a person in the specific state of having recently understood something about themselves that they're going to have to carry forward. Not comfortable, not apologetic in the performance sense, just present with it. "The rifle," he said in the evaluation. She said, "I know. I need to say it out loud. I adjusted the elevation turret the night before. 0.3 minutes low. I told myself it was just he stopped. Started again. I told myself it was a minor adjustment. That someone as qualified as I assumed you weren't would never catch it. That it would produce a small miss that I could attribute to Quantico training methodology. And that would be the end of the discussion." Mercer was looking at him. "I was wrong," Barrett said. "About the adjustment. About you. About he seemed to be working through a specific internal inventory. About what I thought I was protecting when I did it." Claire looked at him for a long moment. The thing that moved through her was not satisfaction, which surprised her a little. She'd expected something closer to that. What she actually felt was something more like recognition, the recognition of a person encountering the moment when what they've known about someone and what that someone actually is finally align. She said, "What were you protecting?" He didn't look away. "My place. My unit. The thing I'd built my whole career into being the best at." He paused. "I thought if you outshot me, it meant I was less. I know how that sounds." "It sounds like fear," she said. "Fear with really bad timing." He almost winced. "Yeah. You want to know what the actual problem with it is?" He nodded once. "It wasn't that you adjusted the rifle," she said. "Operators make judgment calls about competitors all the time. The problem is that you did it in an environment that was supposed to produce honest data about preparedness. You took a training evaluation, the thing that tells command whether a team is actually ready, and you compromised it to protect your ego. Which means the next time command looks at that evaluation record, they're looking at data you corrupted. They might make a decision based on it. A real one. About a real situation." He stood with that for a moment. "A broken rifle on a training range can be fixed," she said. "But the decision that got made because the broken rifle produced numbers that looked clean, you can't always fix that one after the fact." He said, "I know." And the way he said it told her he did. "You need to report it," she said. "What you did. To Mercer and to the evaluation record. Not because I'm asking you to. Because it's the only way the data gets corrected and the only way the trust gets a chance to rebuild." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "And if I do that, if I report it, what happens to me?" She said, "I don't know. That depends on things above both our pay grades. But I know what happens if you don't report it." He understood. Mercer said, from behind them, "I'll need that report, Chief. In writing tonight." Barrett didn't flinch. He nodded once, the nod of a man who has made a decision he's not going to negotiate with himself about, and said, "Yes, sir." Then he looked at Claire one more time. "I'm sorry. Not because of how it ended. I'm sorry because I made it." He paused. "There's a difference," she said. "Yes, there is." He walked away toward the operations tent. Mercer watched him go. Then he turned back to Claire and said, "He's a good operator." "He is," she said. "He's also scared of becoming less relevant in a world that keeps changing around him. That's not a flaw specific to Barrett. It's a flaw specific to people." Vaughn, who had been standing with the patience of a man who has learned that some conversations need to finish before the operational ones can begin, said Rourke. "He's contained in the northeast tunnel. The federal agents have a team going in from the upper access point now. He's not going anywhere, Claire said. He'll claim the targeting software upload was complete. He'll claim the satellite window opened before I took the relay down. We know the window wasn't open yet, Vaughn said. We know that. He'll say we're wrong. He'll say the damage to the relay was post-upload. He'll spend 2 years in litigation, making it very expensive to prove otherwise. She paused. Unless Rebecca can tell us specifically what the software contained and what damage it could do if it had been uploaded. Vaughn looked at her. Then at Rebecca across the staging area. Claire walked over. Rebecca looked up from her cup, which was empty now, and said, I heard the last part of that. Can you give us a technical summary of what the software does? Claire asked. Rebecca set the cup down. The targeting software is a personnel identification system, military grade, classified development. It works by cross-referencing encrypted surveillance network data with biometric profiles of active duty personnel. If someone has access to the data set and runs it against surveillance feeds in foreign urban environments, they can identify American military personnel even when they're operating in civilian cover. The weight of this settled over the staging area like weather. If that software had been uploaded and distributed, Rebecca continued, every operator running a covert identification in the next 3 years would have been at risk. Every face in that dataset. She stopped. Rourke wasn't selling targeting software. He was selling a kill list with the ability to update itself in real time. The silence after this was the longest one yet. Mercer said very quietly, how many names in the dataset? Rebecca said the version he had access to? Approximately 4,000 active duty personnel. Special operations, intelligence, and high-value liaison positions across 31 countries. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Claire said, so the satellite phone battery. Rebecca said, was the most important thing I've done in 11 years of federal contract work. Yes. Claire looked at her with a respect that didn't need to be performed because it was simply accurate. Then she turned back to Mercer. He was looking at her with an expression that had moved through several phases in the past hour and had arrived somewhere she recognized not gratitude, exactly, though that was part of it. Something more structural, the look of a person who has had a fundamental assumption corrected and is in the process of rebuilding around the correction. He said 4 years ago in Syria, if you hadn't taken that shot, she said 3 wounded men couldn't have moved. The advancing force would have overrun the position. You know the math. I know the math, he said. I've done it many times trying to figure out what actually happened. I just kept getting the wrong answer because I was missing the variable. You were missing me, she said. It wasn't bitter. It was just true. He held her gaze. Donovan. I want to say something and I need to say it accurately, so I'm going to take a moment to make sure I'm saying it right. She waited. I made a decision yesterday, 2 days ago, when you stood in that briefing room and told me the Overwatch position was compromised. I had the information. I had your credentials. I had the morning's range evaluation, which should have resolved every question I had about your operational judgment. And I made the choice to proceed with the approved plan instead of adapting to the assessment you'd given me. He paused. My team went into an ambush that you identified before they were in it. Hale is going to be off active duty for 8 weeks because of a fault line you flagged in photographs that I didn't look at closely enough. She said, Commander, I'm not finished, he said. Not harshly, just clearly. I've been in command long enough to know the difference between a mistake made from incomplete information and one made from incomplete judgment. Yesterday was the second kind. I had the information. I chose the institutional plan over the specific evidence because the evidence came from someone my institutional habits told me not to fully trust. And I need to own that. The same way I'm going to require Barrett to own what he did. She let him finish. Then she said, what are you going to do with it? He thought about it. Change what I check, he said, and what I'm willing to hear from people whose records I can't verify. That's a start, she said. Is it enough? She looked at him steadily. It depends on whether you mean it or whether you're saying it, because this situation made it the right thing to say. He held her gaze without looking away. I mean it. She believed him. Not because he was a commander and she was a staff sergeant, and commanders generally mean things they say in formal contexts. She believed him because of the specific quality of effort it had taken him to say it, the careful, deliberate honesty of a man who could have chosen a softer version of this conversation and had decided instead to use the accurate one. Then it's enough, she said. Vaughn stepped forward. There's one more piece, he said. Something in his voice made both of them turn. He was holding a folded document. Not a tablet, not a digital display, actual paper. The kind that gets used when the record being created needs to exist in a form that is harder to modify than a file. He held it like a man holds something that is both an obligation and a long time coming. He said, the intermediary official who processed the seal on Donovan's record. The one Rourke you asked. Vaughn said. His name is Deputy Director Alan Forsyth. He processed the classification seal 8 months after Syria. He believed it was routine. But Rourke had given him falsified documentation showing that Donovan's identity had been compromised at the operational level and that the seal was a standard personnel protection measure. He paused. Forsyth had no idea he was helping bury a decorated marksman's record to protect a contractor's criminal network. Does he know now? Claire asked. He's known for 6 weeks, Vaughn said. Since we started pulling threads 2 months ago. He's been cooperating with the investigation. He's the reason we have enough documentation on Rourke's contractor chain to prosecute rather than just contain. Vaughn looked at Claire directly. And he's the reason this exists. He held out the document. She took it. It was a declassification order. Her record. Everything that had been sealed 4 years ago, the Syria mission, the 5 shots, the chain, the protected personnel, the full operational context brought back into the official record with the citation attached. She read it once, then again. Not because the words were unclear. Because she needed the time to understand what it felt like to read your own name in a document that confirms what you knew was true, but were never allowed to prove. It felt like exhaling something she'd been holding for 4 years. She folded the document once and put it in her jacket pocket. Mercer said, "What does it say?" She said, "It says what happened." He said, she looked at him, at Vaughn, at the staging area around her, where the team was moving through the particular organized aftermath of a completed operation gear being secured, reports being started, the institutional machinery of accountability beginning to turn. At Rebecca, who was now talking to the federal agents with the precise, useful detail of someone who has decided to be maximally helpful to the process. At the shaft entrance, where the mountain outside was completely still. She thought about the answer to his question. Not the facts of it, those were in the document in her pocket, and they would be in the official record by the end of the week. The other part of the answer, the part that had been the actual content of the past 4 years. She said a sniper made 5 impossible shots in a sandstorm, saved 8 men, and then disappeared because someone with more institutional power than honesty decided that was more useful than the truth. She paused. What it says is that she was right all along. Mercer stood with that for a moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected, in the tone of someone who is not building toward a larger speech, but simply saying a true thing. The last time your team needed a sniper, you were the one behind the rifle. She looked at him. He said, "That's what you said in the briefing room when I asked what qualified you. I've been thinking about it since you said it. I thought at the time it was a dodge, something carefully chosen to sound significant without being specific." He paused. "It wasn't a dodge." "No," she said, "it was the most specific thing anyone said in that room." "Yes," she said, "and I still didn't listen." She held his gaze. "You're listening now." He was. And outside on the mountain, in the northeast tunnel behind an ore gate, she'd dropped with a shot at 900 yards through a 4-inch bracket target. Mason Rourke was sitting in the dark, listening to the sound of the federal extraction team coming for him, and understanding for the first time in 4 years that the loose thread he'd thought he'd buried under paperwork and clearance levels and institutional inertia had not disappeared. It had simply been waiting for the right mountain. She looked up at the shaft entrance, at the particular angle of light coming through it, the way it had shifted from the morning's hard clarity to the softer, longer light of mid-afternoon. Somewhere up above her on the secondary ridge was the position she'd held for 2 hours, while the world below it rearranged itself around choices that had been made years ago and were only now producing their final consequences. She had done what she came to do. She had proven what needed to be proven. And now the part that came after proving things was beginning the complicated institutional, slow-moving process of making the proof matter in a durable way. Making it change something real, something that would still be different in 5 years and 10 years, when the mountain and the mine and the names on this debrief were long since filed away in a record that nobody looked at twice. That was the harder work. She had always known it. The question was whether she'd be allowed to do it. Vaughn said, "There's an offer I need to put in front of you. Officially. When the debrief is complete and Rourke is processed." He paused. "It came from 2 levels above my station." She looked at him. Don't answer it yet, he said. Let the day finish first. She nodded, but she already knew what she was going to say. She had known it, she realized, since the morning she'd first read the assignment orders for Fort Elkhorn and understood that the mine complex in the aerial photographs was not a coincidence, and that 4 years of waiting had finally produced the specific moment where everything she knew could be applied to something that mattered. She had come here to prove something. She had. She had come to stop someone. She had. She had come to recover what had been taken from her by a system she'd served faithfully, without bitterness, without breaking, without becoming less precise in her judgment, because her judgment had been dismissed. She had done all of it, and now it was time to build something with the space that the doing of it had created. The day, as Vaughn had said, was not quite finished. But she could feel the shape of what came next settling into place the way a shot settles, not rushed, not forced. Just inevitable once you've done the math correctly. She reached into her jacket pocket, felt the folded edge of the declassification document against her fingers. 4 years, 5 shots, 1 chain, and now finally, accurately, officially her name attached to all of it. It was enough to work with. The formal debrief began at 1400 hours in the lower level staging area, and it lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes, which was longer than most field debriefs and shorter than it deserved to be given everything that needed to be unpacked from the past 48 hours. Mercer ran it with the precision he brought to everything methodical, chronological, giving each team member the space to report their own sequence of the operation without interruption before asking questions. Claire sat at the far end of the table and answered what she was asked and volunteered what wasn't asked but needed to be said, which was a distinction she'd always found more important than the institutional preference for waiting to be prompted. The federal agents sat in, took notes, asked technical questions about the relay dish, the OR gate mechanism, the transmitter array, the jamming equipment's hardware configuration. She answered them with the same precision she'd used on the mountain, no embellishment, no compression, nothing added or removed to make the picture more comfortable or more dramatic than it actually was. At 16:20, one of the federal agents asked her how she had identified the maintenance shaft from aerial photographs, when the mine's official documentation showed no such structure. She said the thermal variance in the imagery was 4 degrees above ambient. Closed, inactive shafts don't produce thermal variance. Active shafts do because they have airflow. The airflow was consistent with a passage of approximately 1.2 meters in diameter, running approximately 40 meters into the rock before connecting to the lower level. The original mine survey showed a ventilation point at that location that had been marked as collapsed and sealed in a 1994 remediation report. The thermal data said it wasn't sealed. The federal agent wrote this down, then looked up and said, "How long did that analysis take you?" "About 7 minutes." She said, "He wrote that down too," with an expression that suggested he was going to be thinking about those 7 minutes for a while. At 17:10, Mason Rourke was brought through the staging area on his way to the federal transport. His wrists were secured. He walked with the particular bearing of a man who has already begun constructing his legal defense, not defeated, not broken, but recalibrated, shifting from operational mode to institutional mode, understanding that the next years of his life would be fought in rooms with fluorescent lighting and federal statutes rather than mountains and satellite windows. He saw Claire as he was being walked through. He stopped. The agents on either side of him stopped with him, hands tightening on his arms. He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back because she had never been afraid of Mason Rourke. She had been frustrated by him, thwarted by him, professionally erased by him, but not afraid. Fear required uncertainty about the outcome, and she had never been uncertain about this one. She had simply been waiting for the moment when the correct outcome could be demonstrated rather than just known. He said, "You should be dead." She said, "You've said that before." The answer doesn't change. Something moved across his face. Not anger, he was past anger. It was something more considered. The look of a man acknowledging a miscalculation without yet being willing to call it that. He said the record seal was legal. Everything I did was inside the institutional framework. She said, institutional frameworks are built by people. People who make mistakes. People who get corrected. She paused. "You'll have a lot of time to think about that." The agents moved him forward. He didn't look back. She watched him go and felt something she hadn't expected, not triumph, not the satisfaction she'd thought 4 years of waiting would produce. Just the quiet, clear sense of a weight that had been redistributed. Not removed. Redistributed. Rourke going into federal custody didn't undo the years. Didn't give them back. Didn't restore what had been spent holding the shape of herself together, while the system she'd served processed her as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be seen. But it was accurate. And accuracy, she had learned, was the thing she valued above all others. Not comfort, not vindication. Just the world being a correct representation of what had actually happened. She could work with accuracy. She had always been able to work with accuracy. It was everything else that was the problem. Vaughn found her 40 minutes later, outside the shaft entrance, where the evening was beginning its slow arrival over the mountain, and the air had developed the particular cold edge that Montana evenings carry, even in mild months. She was sitting on a flat section of rock with the declassification document in her hands, reading it for the third time. Not because she hadn't absorbed it. Because there is a kind of reading that isn't about information but about making something real, pressing a fact against your understanding of yourself until the gap between what happened and what was officially acknowledged finally closes. He sat next to her, let her finish the page she was on. Then he said the offer. She said, "Tell me." Joint Precision Response Program, he said. New initiative out of the Interagency Coordination Office. The mandate is to develop the next generation of precision operators across all branches, not just snipers in the technical sense, but the broader category. People who can read terrain, manage uncertainty, make consequential decisions under pressure, and understand the downstream effects of what they do. He paused. The program needs someone to build the evaluation framework and lead the first training class. Someone who understands that the selection criteria we've been using produce excellent shooters and occasionally miss the people who are actually most capable of doing the job. She said, "Who identified me for this?" Rebecca Sloan. She turned and looked at him. He said, "She made the recommendation before the debrief was finished. Said, and I'm quoting directly, that you were the first person she'd observed in a crisis situation who appeared to be solving a different and more important problem than the one everyone else thought was the problem." He paused. She said that was the quality she'd want in the person designing the evaluation framework for the next generation of people who would be protecting federal assets. Claire held this, turned it over. "She's not wrong," she finally said. "No," Vaughn said, "she's not. Where is the program based?" "Virginia. Quantico adjacent but separate command structure. You'd report directly to the interagency office, not through the standard Marine chain. It gives you authority over the evaluation criteria, the candidate selection, the curriculum architecture." She said, "Rank, majority, with a pathway to lieutenant colonel if the program achieves its 3-year performance benchmarks." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have conditions." Vaughn said, "I expected you to. The evaluation criteria cannot weight physical performance metrics above cognitive and decision quality metrics. I've seen too many programs that select for the person who can shoot a tight group at distance, and then produce operators who are excellent on a clean range and dangerous in complex situations because they've never been trained to tolerate uncertainty." "Agreed," Vaughn said. "What else?" "Candidates come from all branches and all backgrounds. The program doesn't get to pre-select for demographic categories. It selects for the qualities the program is designed to develop, and it lets the candidates demonstrate whether they have them. That's going to create institutional friction." "Institutional friction," she said, "is what happens when institutions encounter accurate information about themselves. It passes." She paused. "What else are you expecting me to say no to?" He almost smiled. "The clearance review on Barrett's evaluation report. The institutional pathway for his return to duty." She said, "He reports what he did. Full written account, no omissions. The evaluation record gets corrected. He goes through a disciplinary review, whatever the appropriate process produces, it produces. And then when that process is complete, if the review determines he can return to duty, he does. With retraining on the specific competencies the incident revealed as deficient. You're not calling for him to be separated. He's an exceptional operator," she said. "Exceptional operators don't grow on trees. The military spent years and enormous institutional resources producing Owen Barrett. Those resources don't become worthless because he made a decision rooted in fear. What becomes worthless is the investment if the system doesn't give him a structured path back to accountability." Vaughn looked at her. "You know he tried to make you fail." "I know," she said. "I also know why. And I know that the version of Barrett I spoke to in that staging area after the ore gate came down was a different person than the one who adjusted the rifle turret the night before the evaluation. Not a better person necessarily, but a person who'd been shown something accurate about himself and was choosing to stand in front of it rather than away from it. That's worth something, even after what he did. She said, especially then. People who only behave well when they've already been behaving well aren't demonstrating character. They're demonstrating habit. Character is what someone does with the moment after they've done the wrong thing. Vaughn sat with this for a moment. Then he said, one more condition I'm anticipating. She said, the program's first class includes Rebecca Sloan as a civilian advisory consultant. Her systems background and her performance in the field today are exactly the profile the program is designed to identify. She's not an operator, but she demonstrated operational judgment under the kind of pressure that the evaluation framework needs to account for. He said, she's already been offered a position with the federal agency. Good. Then she can do both. She'll bring something to the program that the military candidates won't have, and they'll bring something she won't have. And the friction between those things is exactly the educational environment I want to create. Vaughn looked at her with an expression that was 40% professional admiration and 60% the look of a man who has been advocating for something for 4 years and is experiencing the specific exhaustion and relief of watching it finally become real. He said, you've been thinking about this program for a while. She said, I've been thinking about what I would build if someone gave me the authority to build it since the first time I watched a qualified candidate get passed over because they didn't fit the aesthetic of what an elite operator is supposed to look like. She paused. That was a long time ago. She thought about it. Before Syria. He nodded slowly. Then it's time. She folded the declassification document and put it back in her pocket. Looked at the mountain. At the last light working its way down the western face, the shadow line descending the upper ridge moving from amber to the first suggestion of dusk. Yes, she said. It is. Inside the staging area, Mercer was completing the final section of his after-action report. She could see him through the shaft entrance, sitting at the field table, writing by hand rather than typing, which surprised her until she thought about it and understood. Some things you write by hand because the physical act of forming the words is part of how you take responsibility for them. Keyboards produce documentation. Handwriting produces reckoning. She walked back in. He looked up when she approached. Set his pen down. She said, the after-action. It's honest. How honest? He held her gaze. I wrote that the operation's primary intelligence assessment was compromised by my failure to incorporate available field analysis into the operational plan. I wrote that a qualified evaluator provided specific warnings about ingress route safety, thermal conditions, and indicators of pre-positioned hostile activity, and that I chose the approved institutional plan over the specific field evidence. I wrote that this decision resulted in the team entering a containment ambush that had been identified and reported before entry and could have been avoided. He paused. I wrote that the operation's successful resolution was the direct result of the field evaluator's autonomous action from the secondary overwatch position, and that her tactical decisions, including the relay intercept, the team communication window, the suppression sequence, and the ore gate shot were the defining factors in securing the hostage and containing the primary subject. She said, you didn't have to write all of that. He said, yes, I did. She understood what he meant. Not the obligation, the need. The particular need of a person whose identity is built around operational excellence and honest assessment, who has just produced documentation that holds both of those things in the same page. She said the program Vaughn briefed me on, the Joint Precision Response Program. Mercer nodded. He told me about it last week. Asked if I'd be willing to serve as an advisory commander for the institutional integration component, building the relationship between the program's graduates and existing Tier 1 units. Are you willing? He considered for what she sensed was the amount of time it actually took him rather than a performative pause. Yes, on one condition of my own, which is that you let me bring this unit through the program's first evaluation framework as a cohort, not to certify them, they're already certified, but to go through your evaluation design and come out the other side with an honest picture of where we're genuinely strong and where we've been giving ourselves credit based on tradition rather than evidence. She looked at him for a long moment. This was not the offer she'd expected. It was more than the offer she'd expected. It required something from him that institutional pride usually prevents the willingness to subject an established decorated, proven unit to a framework designed by someone that unit had initially dismissed for the explicit purpose of finding out where that dismissal had been hiding real deficiencies. She said, your men will resist it. Some of them, he said. Barrett will resist it most. He paused, and then he'll be the most changed by it. In my experience, the people who resist honest evaluation most strongly are usually the ones who most need what it reveals. That's going to make for a difficult first class. Difficult, he said, is not the same as wrong. She heard herself in that sentence. Didn't say so, but noted it. Agreed, she said. He picked up his pen, went back to the report. She was halfway back to the entrance when he said, without looking up, Donovan, she stopped, your file is declassified. That means the Syria citation is now part of the public military record. The shot, the chain, all 5. They're going to want to put your name on something official. A commendation ceremony, the kind with cameras. She said, I know. How do you feel about that? She thought about it honestly. About what cameras meant and what commendations meant, and what the difference was between recognition and acknowledgement, which were not the same thing, and which people routinely confused for each other. She said, I feel like a ceremony with cameras is something that happens after the work is done. And the work isn't done. He almost smiled. It was the same almost smile she'd seen from Hale on the range, from Rebecca in the staging area, the expression of people encountering something more precise than they were expecting. He said, the work is never done. No, she said, but some parts of it finish, and then the next parts begin. And the part that's beginning now is the one I've been waiting to start. She walked out of the shaft entrance into the Montana evening, where the mountain was large and quiet and completely indifferent to everything that had happened on it today, the way mountains are indifferent to everything, in the way that only things older than human decisions can be. She found Barrett outside. He was sitting on the same flat rock she'd been on with Vaughn 20 minutes earlier, and he had a piece of paper in his hands that she recognized as the beginning of a written report. He was staring at it with the expression of a man who has decided to do something difficult and is currently locating the exact starting point. She sat down next to him, not close, but within conversation range. He said, without looking up, I don't know how to start it. She said, start with what you did, not why you did it, not how you felt about it. Just what you did when you did it and what result it was designed to produce. He was quiet. The why and the how you felt, she said, can come later. Once the factual record is established, there's a framework to attach the rest to. But the factual record has to come first. He said, what if the factual record ends my career? She said, what if it doesn't? He looked at her. You think it won't? I think the military has a specific interest in understanding what produces the decision you made, she said. Not to punish the decision, though, accountability, for it is appropriate, and you know that. But to understand the conditions that made a 12-year operator with an excellent record decide that compromising an evaluation was a reasonable solution to feeling threatened. She paused. That's not just your problem. That's a systemic problem. And systemic problems need case studies, honest ones. He said, you're saying I could become a lesson. She said, I'm saying you already are one. The only question is whether you write it yourself or let someone else write it for you. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he looked back at the paper. He put his pen to it and started writing. She left him there and walked the perimeter of the staging area, which she did not need to do for any operational reason, but which gave her the distance and the movement that thinking clearly sometimes requires. She was processing the past 3 days in the way she processed everything, not emotionally first, but structurally. The shape of what had happened, the sequence of decisions and consequences, the places where the system had produced its usual outcomes, and the places where it had been bent away from those outcomes by specific choices made by specific people. Rourke in custody, Rebecca recovering and already moving toward usefulness. Hale's leg broken in 2 places but clean breaks, good prognosis, 8 weeks and he'd be back. Barrett writing the most important document of his career on a flat rock outside a Montana mine shaft. Mercer inside completing an after-action report that would be referenced by the interagency office for the next decade as an example of operational command accountability, and her name on a declassification document in her jacket pocket. She stopped walking. Hale was nearby, his injured leg elevated on a pack, a second cup of something hot in his hands. He was watching her with the same quality of attention he'd had from the first moment in the briefing room, the honest attention of someone who is actually trying to understand rather than simply observe. He said, the program Vaughn's putting you in charge of. She said, news travels. Military staging areas are not known for their discretion, he said. Will it take candidates who aren't already certified operators? She looked at him. The mandate is candidates from all branches and all backgrounds. Why? He said. Because I've been thinking about the question you'd probably ask on day one of that program, about what the first shot should be. He paused. And I think I've been thinking about it wrong my whole career. She said, how have you been thinking about it? Like the first shot is always at the threat, he said. The most obvious threat, the most immediate one. Shoot the threat, secure the space, protect the mission. He paused. But watching you today, the sensors, the wind readings, the relay dish, the ore gate, none of those were the obvious threat. Every time you shot something that changed the problem rather than something that ended one element of it. She said, and I think that's a different kind of thinking than what I've been trained to do. And I think a program that could teach people to do that, really do that, not just say they understand, it would produce something the military currently doesn't have. She said, that's the program. He nodded slowly. Then I'd like to be considered for the first class. She said, you'll be on the list. Your leg has to clear medical first. He almost laughed. 8 weeks. Use the time, she said. Think about what the first shot should be. Write it down. Bring it with you, he said. Yes, ma'am. She walked back toward the shaft entrance. Inside, Mercer had finished writing and was reviewing what he'd written with the focused expression of a man holding himself to the standard he's been setting for others. She didn't interrupt him. She moved to the corner of the staging area where her rifle case was stored and ran her hands along the latches in the familiar pattern. The maintenance check, that wasn't really a maintenance check, but a habit of contact, of grounding, of reminding herself what the tool was and what it was for and what it wasn't for. The case was exactly as she'd left it. Some things don't change regardless of what happens around them. She was closing the final latch when one of the federal agents approached. Young, sharp-eyed, the kind of professional competence that hasn't yet accumulated the weight of years. He said, Staff Sergeant Donovan, I wanted to ask you something off the record. She said, go ahead. He said, the bracket shot at the ore gate. He paused. I've been going through the geometry of it since you described it in the debrief. At 900 yards, with the crosswind you described and the thermal conditions, hitting a 4-inch target with a single shot, I've run the calculation 3 times. The probability of a first-round hit on that specific target, from that position, under those conditions, is approximately 4%. She said, the calculation is right. He said, so how did you? I didn't take the shot at a 4-inch target, she said. I took the shot at the one specific 4-inch target that, if hit at the correct angle, with the correct round at the correct moment, would produce a specific mechanical outcome. The 4 inches was the target. The mechanical outcome was the shot. Those are different things. He looked at her. I don't think I understand the distinction. She said, a 4% probability applies when you're trying to hit a target. It doesn't apply when you've understood the target well enough that there's only one shot that produces the result you need, which means the probability of that shot being correct isn't about the 4-inch dimension. It's about whether your understanding of the mechanism was accurate. Either the bracket fails and the gate drops, or it doesn't. Binary outcome. The uncertainty was in the understanding, not the shot. He was quiet for a moment. So the preparation eliminates most of the uncertainty before you touch the trigger, she said. The trigger is the last step. Everything before it is the work. He wrote something in his notebook. She said, what are you writing? He said, the trigger is the last step. Everything before it is the work. He looked up. Is that accurate? Close enough, she said. He thanked her and moved away. She looked at the rifle case. Then she picked it up and walked toward the exit, past Mercer, who looked up as she passed. And she said, the report. When you submit it, put a note at the bottom. He said, what kind of note? She said that the thermal conditions at 0742 on the eastern ridge reduced effective visibility to approximately 700 yards and made the primary overwatch position functionally compromised for precision fire beyond that range. He looked at her for a moment. You want me to document that you were right about the thermals? I want the institutional record to document that field analysis conducted by an experienced operator regardless of institutional rank or gender or assignment status identified a significant operational constraint 48 hours before it became operationally relevant, and that the constraint was validated by conditions during the actual operation. She paused. Not because it makes me look right. Because the next time someone makes that observation and gets laughed at by the chief petty officer in the room, there's a documented case from a classified operation that says taking it seriously is the correct institutional response. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he wrote the note. She watched him write it, then walked out. Outside, the Montana evening had fully arrived, and the mountain was a dark shape against a sky that was doing the complicated, specific business of moving from one kind of blue to another. The air was cold enough to be felt clearly and not cold enough to be a problem. Somewhere above them, on the secondary ridge she'd occupied this morning, her boot prints were in the mountain soil next to a disturbed patch of ground where she'd set up her position, and a spent casing she'd left behind. Because there are some things you leave where they are, rather than collect. Because the place where you did the work is as much a part of the record as the result. She stood outside for a long moment. Then Vaughn came to the entrance behind her and said, "The offer. Your conditions." She said, "Accepted." He said, "All of them?" She said, "All of them." He was quiet for a moment. "Then the first class convenes in 6 months. Virginia. You'll have the facility, the budget, and the authority to build the evaluation framework from the ground up." She said, "6 months." He said, "Is that enough time?" She looked at the mountain. "I've been building the framework for 4 years," she said. 6 months is more than enough time to put it on paper." He went back inside. She stood in the cold evening air and thought about the first day of the program, about the questions she'd ask, about the candidates who would be standing in front of her the way she had stood in front of Barrett's unit 2 days ago, carrying records that told part of the truth, standing in a room that was going to judge them before they had the chance to demonstrate what they actually were. She was going to build something that didn't do that. Something that started from the assumption that the most valuable quality a precision operator can have is not the ability to make the difficult shot. It's the judgment to understand which shot is actually the difficult one, and why that understanding requires more than a trigger and a clear line of sight. It requires knowing what happens after the bullet lands, the full geometry of consequence. She'd been living inside that geometry for 4 years, and now she was going to teach it. She picked up her rifle case, carried it toward the transport, and left the mountain behind her the way she left everything she'd finished with cleanly, completely, without looking back, because looking back is only useful when there's still something there that needs to be changed. And she had changed everything on this mountain that needed changing. What was ahead of her now was the rest of it, the work that didn't end, the kind she'd been waiting her whole career to begin. 6 months to the day after the ore gate came down on Mason Rourke, Claire Donovan walked into a training facility outside Quantico, Virginia, at 0600 hours. And the first thing she did was remove every target from the range. The candidates watched her do it. There were 14 of them. 7 men, 7 women, drawn from 5 different branches, ranging in age from 24 to 39, carrying between them a combined service record that included 4 combat deployments, 2 Silver Stars, 1 Distinguished Flying Cross, a medical doctorate, 3 advanced engineering certifications, and 1 former Olympic marksmanship competitor who had left the trials to enlist the week after her qualifying round. They were not a uniform group. They were not supposed to be. That was the first decision Claire had made when she'd built the evaluation framework. And she'd had to fight for it exactly once before. Vaughn had put the authorization in writing, and the argument stopped being available to anyone who wanted to have it. She pulled the last target from its mount, set it against the wall of the range building, and turned to face the class. 14 people looked back at her, some with the particular alertness of candidates who have been told this program is unlike anything they've been through and are waiting to see whether that's true. Some with the careful neutrality of people who have learned not to show what they're thinking until they understand the room. One, a Marine sergeant named Torres, combat medic, 2 tours in Syria with the specific expression of someone who has already decided they can do whatever is about to be asked of them and is correct. Claire said, "My name is Major Donovan. You've read my file, or the parts of it that are accessible at your clearance level. Some of you have heard things that aren't in the file. Some of what you've heard is accurate. Some of it isn't. What matters is what happens in this room." She paused. "I removed the targets, because targets are the last thing we're going to discuss. The first thing we're going to discuss is this." She held up a photograph. Printed, not projected. She'd made that choice deliberately. Something you hold is different from something you see on a screen. It demands more from the person holding it. The photograph showed the Montana mine complex from the aerial perspective she'd used 6 months ago. The same one she'd studied in her quarters the night before everything went wrong in exactly the way she'd predicted. She said, this was a training exercise that became a real operation. In this photograph, there are 7 indicators that the exercise environment had been compromised and pre-positioned for a hostile containment operation. I identified all 7 from this photograph and 2 supplementary images in approximately 12 minutes. I reported all 7 to the commanding officer on site. The team entered the exercise environment anyway, proceeded along the compromised ingress route, and walked into the ambush that the indicators predicted. She paused. The commanding officer was an exceptional leader. He was not negligent. He was not reckless. He made the institutional choice when the institutional choice and the evidence-based choice were pointing in different directions. The room was completely quiet. He made that choice, Claire said, because his training had optimized him to trust the plan. Because his career had been built inside a system that rewards consistency with institutional frameworks and treats deviation from those frameworks as a liability. Because when a person with no institutional authority presented evidence that contradicted the approved intelligence assessment, the gap between their authority level and the authority level of the assessment was larger than the gap between being wrong and being right. She looked at the photograph. That gap cost one operator 8 weeks of recovery time. It nearly cost 4,000 active duty personnel their covert operational security. And it cost a decorated marksman 4 years of her career. She set the photograph down. That marksman was me, she said. I am telling you this not because I want you to feel sorry about it. I'm telling you because the system that produced that outcome is the same system you came from. And the program you are standing in right now exists for one reason: to produce people who can see the difference between the plan and the evidence and have the judgment and the courage to say so. Torres, in the second row, said quietly, even when nobody wants to hear it. Claire looked at her. Especially then. She let that settle for a moment. Then she said, the photograph. I said there were 7 indicators. I want to know what you see. Take 30 seconds. Then tell me. The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than the one before it. It was working silence. 14 people pressing their attention against a single image, looking for things they hadn't been told to look for, without a framework they'd been pre-given to organize what they found. The first candidate to speak was a Navy intelligence officer named Park. He said, the Northwestern Access Road, the shoulder vegetation on the final section is different from the earlier sections. Recent clearing, Claire said 1. An Air Force captain named Reyes said, the ventilation shaft on the southeast quadrant is running warmer than the ambient. You can see it in the shadow gradient if the image is thermally enhanced. Claire said 2. A young Army Ranger said the primary tunnel entrance. The geological survey data on those mines, that formation type usually has fault lines running under the primary access. The approach path looks like it's crossing exactly where you'd expect the fault to be. He paused. That's not in this image. I'm inferring from the terrain type. Claire said 3. And that inference from incomplete data is worth more than the other 2 observations combined. Tell me why. He thought about it. Because observations 1 and 2 are visible in the photograph. Anyone who looks carefully can find them. The third one isn't there. You have to know to look for it from knowledge that doesn't come from the photograph itself, which means it's the indicator that the most prepared hostile operator would expect to go undetected. Claire said correct. She looked at the rest of the class. His name is Ramirez. Remember how he did that? Ramirez looked like he wasn't sure whether to be proud or concerned. He settled on alert, which was the correct response. The class identified 5 of the 7 indicators in the first 7 minutes. The 6th took another 4 minutes and came from the Olympic marksmanship competitor, a woman named Chen who had been completely silent until that moment, who said, almost casually, the bird flight pattern in the upper right corner of the image. The birds are adjusting their approach vector. That happens when there's elevated human activity or heat signature below their flight path. Something in the northwestern area was disturbing them. Claire said 6. The 7th indicator nobody found. After 15 minutes of looking, Claire pointed it out herself. A single irregular shadow on the eastern face that didn't correspond to any structural element of the mine, the shadow of a person who had been standing at the edge of the upper-level window and had moved just before the photograph was taken, leaving only the edge of their shadow in the frame. She said, I didn't find this one in 12 minutes either. I found it on my third review of the photograph in my quarters, the night before the operation. It was the indicator that confirmed everything the others suggested. And it was invisible unless you'd already decided, based on the other 6, that you were looking for it. She paused. The 7th indicator doesn't teach you to look for shadows. It teaches you that the conclusion you reach from the first 6 tells you what to look for next. Evidence compounds. It doesn't stand alone. The first hour of the program had produced no shooting, no physical evaluation, no marksmanship assessment. It had produced 14 people who were now looking at the world differently than they had been when they walked through the door. Claire could see it in the quality of their attention, the way it had shifted from the watchful readiness of candidates expecting to perform to the focused engagement of people who had just been shown that the performance they're being asked for is something they hadn't yet been measuring. That was the first mini-climax of the first day, and it happened before anyone had touched a rifle. The second came at 1000 hours, when she introduced the evaluation framework's primary assessment structure, not a shooting qualification, a decision audit. Each candidate would be given a scenario realistic, specific, time-pressured, and would be asked to make a series of operational decisions. The decisions would be recorded. The outcomes of the decisions would be modeled. And then the candidate would be asked to account for the reasoning behind each choice, in the sequence they made it, with no opportunity to revise in hindsight. The Army Ranger said, "Ma'am, when does the marksmanship assessment happen?" She said, "After the decision audit." "Why after?" She said, "Because I need to know how you think before I need to know how you shoot." A person who thinks correctly and shoots adequately is more valuable in a complex situation than a person who shoots perfectly and thinks institutionally. The range will tell me where your technical skills are. The audit will tell me where your judgment is. The program will develop both, but in the order that reflects their actual operational priority. He absorbed this. Then he said, "What if someone's decision audit is excellent and their marksmanship is marginal?" She said, "Then we build their marksmanship." Marksmanship is a technical skill. It develops with training. Judgment is harder to build and easier to destroy, which is why we protect it first. She looked at the class. Every one of you was selected because your record suggested you have functional judgment. This program's job is to develop it into something you can access under pressure, communicate clearly, and defend with evidence, not instinct, not rank, not tradition. Evidence. The Olympic shooter, Chen said, "And if our judgment is wrong," Claire said, "then we find out where it was wrong, understand why, and rebuild from there. Wrong judgment that's examined is worth more than right judgment that's never tested." She paused. "Wrong judgment that isn't examined is the thing that gets people killed." Chen nodded once. The nod of someone who has just heard a sentence they were already in the process of knowing and needed to hear externally to complete the circuit. At 1300 hours, Claire ran the first scenario. She gave the class a situation brief that was 18 seconds long. A structure, a hostage, an armed group, a tight satellite window, limited communications, and a specific detail buried in the middle of the brief, almost invisible if you were processing the main elements at normal speed about the structural integrity of the building's northeastern corner. She said, "You have 6 minutes. Decision audit begins now." What happened in the next 6 minutes was the most important thing that had happened in that facility since the building was constructed. 14 people who had been trained by different institutions with different methodologies for different operational environments confronted a scenario that their respective training had prepared them to solve in 13 different ways. Some went immediately to the threat. Some went to the hostage. Some went to the communications problem. Chen went to the northeastern corner detail and stopped there for 45 seconds, working out what it meant before she said anything at all. Torres, the combat medic, said, "At the 2-minute mark, the northeastern corner detail. If the structure is compromised there, then the standard breach point on the eastern face puts the entry team inside the load-bearing problem. You can't use the standard breach. You have to come from the west." She paused. "Which means everything else changes. The cover positions, the comms relay point, the extraction vector. Everything changes because of one structural detail that's easy to miss in an 18-second brief." Claire said everyone heard what Sergeant Torres just said. "Does anyone disagree?" Silence. Then Park said, "I missed the structural detail. I processed the scenario without it. Every decision I made in the first 2 minutes was based on incomplete information I didn't know was incomplete." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the problem. isn't it? You don't know what you missed until something goes wrong, Claire said, or until someone who caught what you missed tells you. Which is why the most operationally critical skill in this room is not marksmanship. It's the ability to create an environment where the person who caught the detail you missed actually tells you. The room was very quiet. She said, that's the program. Everything else we do here is built on that foundation. Technical skill, physical performance, scenario evaluation, all of it rests on the capacity to hear information that contradicts what you thought you knew from a source you didn't expect it from, at a moment when you'd rather be right than accurate. Torres said quietly, that's not training, that's culture. Claire said, yes, that's what we're building. At 15:30, Commander Grant Mercer arrived. He came in without announcement. Claire had expected him, but the class hadn't been told he was coming, which was another deliberate choice. His presence was not ceremonial. He was there to participate in the advisory component of the curriculum, which meant he was going to sit in the same room as 14 candidates and answer questions about how he had made the decisions he'd made. Honestly, without the softening that institutional rank tends to apply to institutional failure. He was in civilian clothes. That was also deliberate. His choice, not Claire's. He'd told her 2 weeks ago that he wasn't coming as a commander. He was coming as a case study. He sat at the side of the room. The candidates looked at him with the particular alertness of people who have been told to expect an important visitor and are trying to calibrate how important without enough information to calibrate accurately. Claire said, this is Grant Mercer. 6 months ago, he commanded the unit on the Montana operation I described this morning. He's here to answer your questions about the decisions he made during that operation. Not the successful decisions, the failed ones. The room absorbed this. Ramirez said carefully, sir, why are you here? Mercer looked at him directly. Because the most useful thing a commander who made preventable errors can do is make sure other commanders understand specifically how those errors were made. Not in the abstract, in detail. He paused. I had 7 indicators in a photograph that told me the ingress route was compromised. A qualified evaluator presented those indicators to me clearly and specifically. I chose the institutional plan. I want you to ask me why I made that choice, and I want to give you an answer that's accurate rather than comfortable. Chen said, why did you make that choice? He said, because the evidence came from someone whose authority level inside the institutional framework didn't match the quality of the evidence they were presenting. And I was trained deeply over many years to weight evidence by the authority of its source, not by the quality of the evidence itself. Park said, and now? And now I'm sitting in a training program designed by the person I dismissed, Mercer said, specifically because the thing that should matter is the quality of the evidence. And I'm here to say that out loud in front of people who are earlier in their careers than I am, so that the version of the mistake I made is something they understand before they make it themselves. The room was completely still. Torres said, does it work? Saying it out loud? Mercer looked at her for a moment. I think it depends on whether the person hearing it believes that authority and accuracy are different things. If they don't believe it, if they've built their whole identity around the institutional framework that says authority is accuracy, then no, it probably doesn't work. He paused. But if they've encountered a moment where those two things were clearly pointed in different directions, then yes, I think it plants something. Claire said, that's why you're here. Not to provide an answer, to plant something. He looked at her with the expression she'd seen on the Montana mountain, the one that had moved through several versions of itself and arrived somewhere durable. He said, is that enough? She said, it's more than most people in your position would offer. He almost smiled. The class watched this exchange with the attention of people who are seeing the demonstration of a principle rather than hearing the description of it, watching two people who have walked through something together and come out on the other side, with a relationship that is built on what actually happened rather than what should have happened. That was the twist the class hadn't been told to look for. Not the scenario, not the structural detail in the brief, the relationship in front of them. The two people who had started 3 days ago in a briefing room where one of them had been laughed at and had arrived at this moment through every difficult, specific, honest exchange in between. That was the curriculum, not the photograph, not the decision audit. This. At 1700 hours, Claire dismissed the class for the day. As the candidates filed out, she caught Torres at the door and said, the northeastern corner detail. You caught it in 2 minutes. Torres said, I'm a medic. We're trained to look for the thing that will kill you, that nobody's paying attention to because everyone's focused on the thing that's obviously wrong. Claire said that training is worth more in a precision operation than most people in this building understand. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Torres looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Is that what happened to you?" They didn't understand what your training was worth. Claire considered the question. It was a precise question, the kind that comes from a person who has been listening very carefully and is connecting things that aren't obviously connected. She said, "They understood what I could do. They didn't understand what I could see. And in this work, the seeing is 80% of the job." Torres said, "And you're building a program that teaches the 80%. Claire said, "I'm building a program that selects for people who already have it and gives them the language and the authority to use it." Torres nodded slowly. Then she said the Barrett situation, the rifle that was calibrated wrong. She paused. "We heard about it. The report was submitted to the institutional record." Claire said, "Yes. How is he?" It was the question Claire hadn't been expecting from a candidate on the first day. It was also the right question, the human question, underneath the institutional narrative, the one that asked not about the outcome, but about the person. She said, "He's in retraining. He's doing it without complaint and without resentment, which is the version of Barrett that's worth keeping. His marksmanship is still exceptional. His self-awareness is improving. I expect he'll return to duty and be better at it than he was before, which is the only outcome that justifies the institutional investment in giving someone a second chance." Torres said, "You advocated for that second chance." "Yes, even after what he did." "Because of what he did after what he did," Claire said. "There's a difference." Torres looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes, ma'am," and walked out. Mercer was the last to leave the room. He picked up his jacket from the chair where he'd set it, stood for a moment looking at the empty range where the targets used to be. He said, "On the first day at Elkhorn, when I asked you what made you believe you belonged beside operators who'd spent years in combat, I've been thinking about your answer." She said, "The last time your team needed a sniper, I was the one behind the rifle." "Yes," he looked at her. "I thought it was a challenge. I thought you were daring me to question you." She said, "It was an accurate statement. I know that now." He paused. "What I didn't understand then is that accurate statements sound like dares to people who aren't ready to hear them. Because accurate statements require a response. You can argue with a dare. You can dismiss a challenge. But an accurate statement about something you should have known that demands something from you." She said, "And you weren't ready to have something demanded of you by someone you'd already decided didn't have the authority to demand it." He said, "No, I wasn't." He looked at the empty range one more time. "What you're building here, the evaluation framework, the decision audit, the structure of the whole program, it's not just training. It's a different claim about what precision means." She said, "Yes, that precision isn't the shot. It's the judgment. The shot is the result of the judgment," she said. "Everything before the shot is the work. I said to a federal agent 6 months ago, and I mean it more now than I did then." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I ask you something I've wanted to ask since the mountain? Syria, 5 shots. The chain." He paused. "Were you scared?" She thought about it honestly. The way she thought about everything, not performing the consideration, but actually doing it. Going back to that moment, the storm, the sand, the calculation, the space between breath and trigger. She said, "No, I wasn't scared during the shots. I was scared before them. When I was doing the calculation and the answer kept coming back to the same conclusion, that there was only one shot that produced the outcome, that saved everyone, I was scared. Because the calculation told me what I had to do, and the thing I had to do was not forgiving of error." She paused. Once the calculation was complete, the fear stopped. There was nothing left to be uncertain about. The shot was either right or it wasn't, and I'd done everything that could be done to make it right. At that point, being scared is just wasted resources. Mercer said, "That's not how most people experience it." She said, "I know. Most people experience the shot as the point of maximum uncertainty. For me, the shot is the point of minimum uncertainty. Everything before it is the uncertainty. The shot is just the answer." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That's what you're teaching. Not how to shoot. How to get to the point where the answer is clear." "Yes," she said. "And how to trust the answer when you get there. Even when the people around you haven't arrived at the same place yet." He said, "Even when the commanding officer hasn't arrived at the same place yet." She said, "Especially then." He put on his jacket, moved toward the door, then stopped. He said, "When you have your first graduation, first class to complete the program, I'd like to be there." not as a visiting commander, as someone who wants to see what it looks like when this works. She said, "You'll be on the list." He nodded once and walked out. She stood in the empty range alone for a moment. No targets, no candidates, no commanders or federal agents or colonels with documents. Just her and the space she'd built and the silence that comes after a beginning rather than an ending. She walked to the wall where she'd set the targets when she'd removed them that morning. 14 paper targets, each one a standard silhouette, each one representing the way the military had traditionally asked its precision operators to understand their purpose. Aim at this shape. Produce a result here. Move to the next. She picked up the top target, looked at it. Then she folded it once and placed it in the trash. Not because targets were wrong, not because marksmanship was irrelevant, but because this room was for something the target couldn't represent: the question that came before the shot, the judgment that made the shot meaningful, the understanding that a rifle was a tool, and tools were only as good as the wisdom of the person holding them. She had been told for 4 years that she was not a sniper because the system that defined snipers couldn't accommodate what she was. She had spent those 4 years being exactly what she was anyway, in every way the system allowed, in several ways it didn't, until the moment arrived when what she was could be demonstrated too clearly to be dismissed. And now she was building the system that would never make that mistake again. Not a system that protected women. Not a system that corrected for tradition or compensated for historical bias. A system that simply, accurately, honestly asked the right question. Not what does this person look like? Not what does their record say? Not who sent them or what clearance level their history sits behind. What does this person see? And what do they do with what they see? Those were the only questions that mattered. Those were the only questions that had ever mattered. She turned off the range lights and walked out into the Virginia evening, where the air was different from Montana, but the sky was the same everywhere in the way that skies are indifferent to rank, indifferent to institutional approval, indifferent to everything except the accuracy of what is placed against it. Somewhere in a federal holding facility, Mason Rourke was 4 months into a process that would take years and produce a result that couldn't be hidden the way he'd hidden her record. Because the documentation this time was held by too many people at too many levels to be buried by any single act of institutional manipulation. Somewhere in a military hospital, Hale was 2 weeks from medical clearance and had already submitted his application to the Joint Precision Response Program with a written essay about what the first shot should be that was the most honest piece of operational self-examination she'd read in her career. Somewhere in a retraining facility, Barrett was working through the specific, unglamorous, daily discipline of becoming accountable, not to the system that would eventually reinstate him, but to the version of himself that had written that report on the flat rock outside the Montana mine shaft. And somewhere in Virginia, starting Monday morning, 14 candidates were going to come back to a range with no targets and start learning the most important thing any of them would ever know about the work they had dedicated their lives to. That a rifle proves nothing. The decision behind it proves everything. She had carried that truth for 4 years in a sealed record. She had demonstrated it on a mountain in Montana in 48 hours. And now she was giving it to the people who came after her, not as a lesson, not as a story, but as a standard. The standard by which the next generation would be measured. And it would hold. Because she had built it out of the only material that doesn't fail under pressure: the truth. Precisely applied at exactly the right moment. That was the shot. That was always the shot.